Hello everyone, welcome to The Missing Link. In tonight's mystery, we present the lost treasure of the Knights Templar, a legendary fortune said to have vanished along with the secretive order that once guarded it, leaving behind cryptic clues and centuries of speculation. It's one of those stories that leaves more questions than answers, and tonight, you'll hear it all. Before we start, please comment where you're listening from and what time it is, as I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, get the lights low. Maybe switch on your fan or something for that background hum. Now, lie back, listen closely, and drift off as the mystery unfolds. Dr. Margaret Holloway had spent 17 years cataloguing medieval manuscripts at the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris, but she had never encountered anything quite like the water-damaged codex that arrived on her desk that October morning. The leather binding bore no identifying marks, and the pages within seemed to shift between Latin, Old French, and symbols she couldn't immediately recognise. The manuscript had been recovered from a flooded basement in Troyes, the ancient capital of Champagne, where the Knights Templar had first been officially recognised by the Catholic Church in 1129. Construction workers had discovered a sealed chamber beneath what had once been the city's medieval quarter, and the flood had damaged but not destroyed its contents. Margaret's specialty was paleography, the study of ancient writing systems, but this document challenged her expertise. The ink appeared to be iron gall, consistent with medieval texts, yet certain passages seemed to have been written with a different substance entirely. Under ultraviolet light, these sections revealed additional text overlaying the visible writing, resulting in an extraordinary complex palimpsest. As she worked through the morning, Margaret began to notice patterns. The mysterious symbols weren't random decorative elements, but appeared to be a sophisticated cipher system. More intriguingly, they seemed to correspond to specific geographic locations mentioned in the Latin text. The document wasn't just a historical record, it was a map of sorts, encoded in a way that would have been invisible to casual readers. The first breakthrough came when Margaret recognised a passage describing the arrest of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, in 1307. But this account differed significantly from the historical record. According to the manuscript, de Molay had been warned of the impending arrests 3 days in advance by a network of sympathisers within the court of King Philip IV. The warning had given the Templars time to implement what the text referred to as the Great Concealment. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she translated the next section. Historians had long assumed that the Templars had not escaped unprepared. They had systematically moved their most valuable assets, not just gold and silver, but something the text called the Foundation of Understanding, to locations across Europe. The operation had been planned for years, a contingency protocol known only to the highest-ranking members of the Order. The document suggested that the legendary Templar treasure was never a single hoard, but a distributed network of caches, each containing different components of what the Knights had considered their true legacy. The monetary wealth was apparently the least significant part. References to the Scrolls of the First Knowledge and the Instruments of Heavenly Calculation suggested that the Templars had possessed texts and devices of far greater historical importance. Margaret photographed each page with meticulous care, noting the precise location of every symbol and mark. The cipher patterns were becoming clearer, revealing what appeared to be a sequence of locations spanning from Scotland to the eastern Mediterranean. Each location was marked with specific astronomical references, suggesting that the hiding places were meant to be found only by someone with knowledge of medieval astronomy and mathematics. That evening, in her apartment overlooking the Seine, Margaret spread photocopies of the manuscript across her dining table. She had contacted 2 colleagues, one a specialist in medieval French history, the other an expert in cryptography. Both had agreed to meet her the following morning, but she hadn't told them the full scope of what she believed she had discovered. The implications were staggering. If the manuscript was authentic, it suggested that the Knights Templar had possessed knowledge and artifacts that had been deliberately hidden from the world for over 7 centuries. The document appeared to be not just a historical record, but a guide for someone who knew how to read its embedded instructions. As midnight approached, Margaret realised she had uncovered something that would change the understanding of medieval history. The question was no longer whether the Templar treasure existed, but whether she was prepared for the consequences of revealing its true nature. 3 days later, Margaret found herself on a train to Edinburgh, accompanied by Dr. James Morrison, a medievalist from Cambridge, who had specialised in the Knights Templars' activities in Scotland. His reaction to the manuscript had been immediate and intense. He had cancelled his lectures and booked them flights within hours of seeing Margaret's translations. The astronomical references in your document correspond perfectly with the alignment of Rosslyn Chapel, Morrison explained, as Scottish countryside rolled past their window. But more importantly, they match calculations I've found in other fragmentary sources that nobody has been able to connect before. Rosslyn Chapel, built in the 15th century by the St. Clair family, had long been associated with Templar legends. The elaborate stone carvings that covered every surface had been interpreted as everything from Christian symbolism to pagan imagery to Masonic codes, but Morrison believed the Paris manuscript provided the key to understanding what the chapel's builders had actually intended. They met with Dr. Sarah MacLeod, the chapel's chief historian, on a grey Thursday morning. MacLeod had been researching the building's mysteries for 20 years, and she led them through the chapel while explaining her theories about its construction. The official story is that William Street Clare built the structure as a family chapel, MacLeod said, pointing to intricate stone pillars that supported the roof. But the level of symbolic complexity suggests something far more significant. The St. Clair family had documented connections to the Knights Templar. Margaret matched the symbols in the manuscript with the carvings on the stone, a discovery that caused her heartbeat to quicken. The chapel's architecture appeared to replicate the cipher system she had identified in the Paris Codex. The manuscript's geographic markers corresponded to specific combinations of carved symbols, encoding a three-dimensional map in stone. Morrison had been studying the famous Apprentice Pillar, a column covered in spiral carvings that had puzzled scholars for centuries. "Margaret, your manuscript mentions the instruments of heavenly calculation. I think this pillar is one of them." The spiral carvings, when viewed from specific angles, revealed mathematical relationships that corresponded to astronomical calculations. The pillar wasn't just decorative, it was a computational device designed to calculate celestial positions and cycles. The St. Clair family had built the chapel not just as a hiding place for physical treasures, but as a repository for the Templars' scientific knowledge. MacLeod led them to the chapel's basement, where recent archaeological work had revealed older foundations beneath the 15th century structure. The basement excavations had revealed a chamber containing a single large stone block, carved with symbols that matched those in the Paris manuscript. "This isn't a foundation stone," Margaret said, running her hands over the carved symbols. "It's a key. These symbols follow the same sequence as the cipher in the manuscript, but they're arranged in a pattern that shows how to locate the other caches." The implications were becoming clear. The Templars had created a network of interconnected hiding places, each one containing clues to the locations of the others. Rosslyn Chapel wasn't just a repository, it was the central hub of a distribution system that had been designed to preserve the Order's knowledge for future generations. As they prepared to leave, Margaret noticed something that made her stop. The late afternoon sun was shining through the chapel's windows at an angle that illuminated specific carved symbols while leaving others in shadow. The illuminated symbols spelled out a message in the same cipher system used in the manuscript. "The light patterns changed throughout the day," MacLeod explained. "We've documented them, but we never understood their significance." Margaret realised that the chapel had been designed as a time-sensitive message system. Different symbols would be illuminated at different times of day and seasons, creating a complex schedule of coded communications. The Templars had built a building that would continue to transmit their secrets for centuries, waiting for someone who understood their cipher system to decode the messages. Margaret's investigation took an unexpected turn when she received an encrypted email from Dr. Marco Benedetti at the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice. Benedetti claimed to have discovered a companion manuscript that would change everything she thought she knew about the Templar treasure. The manuscript had been catalogued as a 14th century merchant's ledger, but Benedetti's examination had revealed it was actually a sophisticated double document with a complete second text hidden beneath the visible commercial records. The hidden text was written in the same cipher system Margaret had identified, and it contained information suggesting the Templars had established a financial network that extended far beyond their known operations. Margaret flew to Venice the following week, leaving Morrison to continue his research at Rosslyn Chapel. Benedetti met her at the airport, his excitement barely contained as he described his discovery. The Templars weren't just warriors and bankers, he explained, as their water taxi navigated the Grand Canal. They were operating a sophisticated information network that connected Europe with the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, and possibly even regions beyond the Mediterranean. The Biblioteca Marciana housed manuscripts dating back to the Byzantine period. Benedetti led Margaret through the library's climate-controlled manuscript room, where the Venice Codex waited on a specialized reading stand. The hidden text, revealed through careful application of chemical reagents, described a system of communication and resource distribution that had operated for over a century before the Templars' official suppression. The network had included merchants, scholars, and religious figures throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, many of whom had no direct connection to the Templar order, but who shared the Knights' commitment to preserving knowledge. It describes something called the Translation Project, Benedetti said, pointing to a passage Margaret translated as she read. The Templars were systematically acquiring and translating texts from Arabic, Greek, and Hebrew sources, creating a library of knowledge that would have been unprecedented in medieval Europe. The translation project had been far more ambitious than the preservation of individual manuscripts. The Templars had been working to create a comprehensive understanding of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that drew from sources across the known world. Their treasure wasn't just gold and silver, it was an intellectual legacy that represented centuries of accumulated human knowledge. Margaret spent 3 days working through the Venice manuscript, gradually piecing together the structure of the Templar network. The system had been designed to survive the destruction of the order itself, with each node capable of operating independently, while maintaining contact with the others. The manuscript mentions a master archive, Margaret told Benedetti. It was apparently the central repository for the most important texts and artifacts. The location is encoded using the same cipher system as the other documents. Benedetti had been studying the financial records hidden within the merchant's ledger, identifying patterns that suggested the Templars had been moving resources to specific locations for decades before their suppression. They weren't just hiding treasure, they were funding a continuation of their work under different auspices. Margaret realized that the Templars' true legacy wasn't hidden in remote castles or buried in secret chambers. The intellectual development of European civilization itself embedded the Templars' legacy. The knowledge they had preserved and transmitted had contributed to the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the development of modern scholarship. The Venice manuscript contained references to other documents in the network, including ones in libraries in Prague, Oxford, and Constantinople. Each location was marked with specific symbols that corresponded to the cipher system Margaret had been studying. The Templars had established a distributed library system that endured for centuries, concealed within the collections of prominent European institutions. Margaret's research led her to Prague, where the manuscript trail pointed to the medieval collections of the Clementinum Library. She had arranged to meet with Dr. Thomas Novak, a specialist in Central Medieval European history, who had been intrigued by her description of the interconnected manuscript network. Prague in November was cold and atmospheric, with morning fog rolling off the Vltava River. Margaret found herself walking through cobblestone streets that had remained largely unchanged since the 14th century, when the Templars' network had been at its height. Novak met her at the Clementinum, the vast Baroque library complex that incorporated much older manuscript collections. He had been researching the library's medieval holdings for years, and Margaret's descriptions of the cipher system had helped him identify several documents that he had previously dismissed as routine religious texts. The cipher appears in at least 12 different manuscripts in our collection, Novak explained as they walked through the library's magnificent Baroque reading room. Without knowing what to look for, they would seem completely unrelated. Margaret examined the manuscripts that Novak had identified, finding consistent patterns that confirmed her growing understanding of the Templar network's scope. The Prague documents contained detailed information about the movement of scholars and texts between universities in Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and Prague itself. One manuscript, ostensibly a 14th century treatise on canon law, contained hidden passages describing the establishment of preservation centres throughout Central Europe. These centres were designed to maintain copies of important texts and to continue the translation project even after the Templars' official suppression. The most interesting document is this one, Novak said, showing Margaret a manuscript that appeared to be a collection of astronomical tables. The calculations are far more sophisticated than anything we would expect from the 14th century. They include corrections for celestial mechanics that weren't officially discovered until the 16th century. Margaret studied the astronomical manuscript, recognizing symbols from the cipher system she had been tracking. The document wasn't just recording celestial observations, it was using astronomical calculations to encode the locations of other manuscripts and preservation centres. The Templars had created a star map that served as a guide to their hidden network. Novak led her to the library's astronomical tower, where medieval scholars had made observations that contributed to the development of European astronomy. Margaret found striking similarities between the tower's design and the computational elements she had identified in Rosslyn Chapel. Margaret informed Novak that the Templars were not merely preserving knowledge, they were actively advancing it. The network was designed to facilitate original research, not just preservation. The Prague manuscripts contained references to collaboration between scholars in different cities, describing joint projects that had continued for decades. The Templars had established a system of scholarly communication that had operated independently of official church and university channels. The most significant discovery came when Margaret identified a manuscript that appeared to be a master index to the entire network. Written in multiple languages and cipher systems, the document referenced hundreds of preserved texts and artifacts across Europe. This suggests that the Templars maintained their network for at least a century after their official suppression, Novak said, as Margaret translated sections of the index. Some of these references date to the early 15th century. Margaret realised that the Templar network had evolved into something resembling a secret university system, with scholars throughout Europe participating in collaborative research projects while maintaining their official positions within conventional institutions. Margaret's investigation reached its climax when she received messages from colleagues in Istanbul and Boston, both claiming to have discovered evidence that the Templar network had extended far beyond Europe. Dr. Yuki Tanaka in Istanbul had found Ottoman manuscripts describing the network's continuation under Islamic protection, while Dr. Robert Whitman at Harvard had identified connections to early American institutions. The evidence from Istanbul was particularly remarkable. The Ottoman sultans had apparently not only tolerated the continuation of the Templar network, but had actively supported it, recognizing the value of maintaining connections to European intellectual centers. Documents in the Suleymaniye Library described collaborative research projects involving scholars from multiple traditions, working together to translate and preserve ancient texts. The network wasn't just European, Margaret realized as she studied photographs of the Ottoman manuscripts. It was truly international, with connections to Islamic scholarship centers and Byzantine institutions. The Templars had created something unprecedented, a multicultural knowledge network that transcended religious and political divisions. The American connection was equally extraordinary. Whitman had discovered that several of Harvard's founders had documented connections to European libraries and scholarly networks that matched the patterns Margaret had been studying. The funding sources and manuscript acquisitions suggested that Harvard had been established as part of a broader knowledge preservation effort. The founders weren't just establishing a college, Margaret realized. They were creating an American branch of a global knowledge network. Harvard was designed to be a preservation center from the beginning. Similar patterns existed at Yale, Princeton, and the College of William and Mary. The network had expanded across the Atlantic, ensuring that the Templars' accumulated knowledge would survive even if European civilization collapsed. Margaret spent weeks coordinating with her international colleagues, gradually piecing together the global scope of the Templar network. The evidence suggested that the network had not only survived into the modern era, but had actually become the foundation of the modern academic system. The documents demonstrated that the network had not only preserved individual texts, but also entire bodies of knowledge that would have otherwise vanished. The translation project had saved classical Greek and Roman texts, Islamic scholarship, and Byzantine learning from destruction. The network had maintained libraries and research centres that had operated independently of official institutions. The network achieved something unprecedented, Margaret told Morrison during one of their regular video conferences. It created a system that could transcend religious, political, and cultural divisions. The Templars established principles of scholarly collaboration that became the foundation of modern academic practice. The investigation had revealed that the network had played a crucial role in every major intellectual development in Western civilization. The Renaissance had been possible because the network had preserved classical texts. The network's tradition of international collaboration had facilitated the scientific revolution. The Enlightenment had built on philosophical texts that the network had maintained for centuries. Margaret realized that the network had been remarkably inclusive for a medieval institution. The documents showed evidence of collaboration between Christian, Islamic, and Jewish scholars, between men and women, and between people of different social classes. Regardless of its source or the identity of its creators, the network remained committed to preserving knowledge. Margaret returned to Paris in February with a profound understanding of what she had discovered. The investigation that had begun with a water-damaged manuscript had revealed the existence of a knowledge preservation network that had operated for over 7 centuries and had fundamentally shaped the intellectual development of human civilization. Back in her office at the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, Margaret spread out copies of all the documents she had studied. The manuscripts from Paris, Scotland, Venice, Prague, Istanbul, and Boston formed a comprehensive picture of the Templars' true legacy. The Templars' treasure was never about gold or silver, Margaret told Morrison, who had flown from Edinburgh to hear her conclusions. It was about creating a system that could preserve and transmit human knowledge across centuries and civilizations. The evidence was overwhelming. The network had operated continuously from the 12th century to the present day, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its core mission of knowledge preservation. The preservation centres had evolved from medieval monasteries to Renaissance libraries to modern research universities. Margaret had identified patterns that suggested the network was still operating in the 21st century. Modern academic institutions, research foundations, and scholarly networks showed the same characteristics that had defined the Templars' original system. The network had not disappeared. It had become so successful that it was now embedded in the fundamental structure of contemporary scholarship. The documents revealed that the network had preserved entire bodies of knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. The network had maintained libraries and research centres that had operated independently of official institutions, ensuring that knowledge would survive even when governments and religious authorities tried to suppress it. The network's greatest achievement was its adaptability, Margaret realised. It survived the Crusades, the Black Death, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, and 2 world wars. It adapted to each new challenge while maintaining its core mission. The evidence suggested that the network had played a crucial role in every major intellectual development in Western civilization. The network had been committed to preserving knowledge regardless of its source, creating a system that could serve all of humanity. Margaret spent the rest of February preparing her findings for publication. The research would require years of additional investigation to fully document, but the basic outlines were clear. The Knights Templar had created the most successful knowledge preservation system in human history. The true treasure of the Knights Templar was not gold or silver, but the intellectual infrastructure of modern civilization. They had preserved and transmitted the knowledge that had made the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment possible. Their greatest achievement was not the accumulation of wealth, but the creation of a system that could serve humanity's eternal quest for knowledge and understanding. As Margaret looked out her office window at the city of Paris, she realised that she was surrounded by evidence of the Templars' legacy. The libraries, universities, and research institutions that filled the city were all part of the network that the medieval knights had established. The treasure had never been hidden. It had been hiding in plain sight, embedded in the foundations of human knowledge itself. The investigation was complete, but Margaret knew that the network's work would continue. The principles that the Templars had established, the free exchange of ideas, international collaboration, and the preservation of knowledge for future generations, would guide humanity's intellectual development for centuries to come. The treasure of the Knights Templar was not a historical artifact, but a living system that would continue to serve humanity's eternal quest for truth and understanding. The telephone rang at 3:47 a.m. in the cramped office of the Sverdlovsk Search and Rescue Headquarters. Captain Mikhail Potapov had been expecting this call for 3 days, though he'd hoped it would never come. The voice on the other end belonged to Yuri Blinov, university administrator and father figure to the missing expedition group. They should have sent word by now. Blinov's voice carried the particular strain of someone who'd been awake for days. The telegram was supposed to arrive yesterday at the latest. Potapov knew the statistics. In the Ural Mountains, when experienced hikers missed their check-in by more than 24 hours during winter, the survival rate dropped to numbers no one spoke aloud. But these weren't ordinary hikers. Igor Dyatlov's group represented the finest outdoor enthusiasts the Ural Polytechnic Institute had produced. 9 students and 1 graduate, all seasoned mountaineers with collective decades of winter experience. The expedition had departed on January 23, 1959, bound for Otorten Mountain. Their planned route would take them through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the northern Urals, but for this group it represented an achievable challenge rather than a death wish. They'd meticulously planned every detail, from food rations calculated to the gram to backup equipment stored in waterproof containers. As Potapov assembled his search team, he reviewed the expedition's roster. Igor Dyatlov, 23, the group's leader and an engineering student whose previous expeditions had become legendary among his peers. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, one of the few women brave enough to attempt winter mountaineering in an era when such pursuits were considered masculine domains. Alexander Kolovatov, 24, a meteorology student whose understanding of weather patterns had saved multiple expeditions from disaster. The list continued with names that would soon become etched in mystery. Yuri Doroshenko, Georgy Krivonishenko, Yuri Yudin, Rustem Slobodin, Nikolai Thibaut Brignol, and Lyudmila Dubinina. Each possessed specialized skills that made them invaluable team members. Yudin, however, had turned back early due to illness, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. When the search party finally reached the abandoned truck that had transported the group to their starting point, they found it exactly as expected, properly secured, with extra supplies stored inside. The real investigation began when they discovered the tent on the slopes of Kholat Shachel, a mountain whose Mansi name translated to Dead Mountain. The scene defied every principle of wilderness survival Potapov had learned in his 15 years of mountain rescue. The tent had been cut open from the inside, not torn by wind or damaged by external forces. The cuts were deliberate and methodical, made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Yet the pattern made no sense. Why would experienced mountaineers destroy their only shelter during a blizzard? More disturbing were the footprints leading away from the tent. 9 sets of tracks, some barefoot, others in socks or single boots, headed down the slope toward the tree line. These weren't the panicked, scattered tracks of people fleeing in terror. They moved in a roughly organized formation, suggesting the group had evacuated together with some degree of coordination. The temperature that night had plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Even with proper cold weather gear, survival time in such conditions is measured in minutes, not hours. Yet the footprints indicated the group had walked nearly a mile from their shelter, down an exposed slope that offered no protection from the wind. As the search team followed the tracks, they discovered something that would become one of the incident's most puzzling aspects: personal belongings scattered along the route. The personal belongings were not dropped randomly, but were placed with apparent deliberation. Someone had left a flashlight on, and it was still in working order. Despite the apparent urgency of the situation, a piece of clothing lay there, folded. The first bodies were found near the tree line, beneath a large cedar tree. Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko lay side by side, dressed only in underwear despite the deadly cold. Their hands showed signs of desperate climbing attempts on the cedar's trunk, with bark embedded under their fingernails and skin scraped raw. Someone had built a fire nearby, evidenced by the charred branches and ash circle, but it had been insufficient to sustain life in such extreme conditions. The scene suggested a group that had fled their shelter in extreme haste, yet had somehow maintained enough composure to attempt survival strategies. This contradiction would become the foundation of countless theories, each attempting to explain how rational, experienced mountaineers could make such seemingly irrational decisions. 3 more bodies were discovered along the route back toward the tent, as if they had attempted to return to their shelter, but succumbed to the cold. Igor Dyatlov himself was found 300 meters from the cedar tree, his body positioned as though he had been crawling uphill. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found further along, and Rustem Slobodin was closest to the tent, just 480 meters from their abandoned shelter. Exposure and hypothermia could potentially explain these 5 tragic deaths. The true mystery pertained to the remaining 4 team members, whose bodies remained undiscovered for an additional 2 months. When they were finally discovered in a snow-covered ravine, the investigation would take a turn that transformed a wilderness tragedy into one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern era. The spring thaw of 1959 arrived later than usual in the northern Urals, extending the search for the remaining 4 expedition members well into May. Search teams had combed every likely location, following protocols developed over decades of mountain rescue operations, yet the bodies of Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, Lyudmila Dubinina, and Yuri Yudin seemed to have vanished into the mountain itself. Senior investigator Lev Ivanov had taken personal charge of the case, recognizing that the incident had implications far beyond a simple mountaineering accident. The Soviet system demanded explanations, particularly when 9 of the country's brightest young minds had died under mysterious circumstances. The families deserved answers, and the mountaineering community needed to understand what had gone wrong to prevent future tragedies. The breakthrough came on May 4th, when a search team discovered a section of snow that had settled differently than the surrounding area. Beneath this depression, they found what appeared to be a makeshift shelter. Branches and clothing arranged in a pattern that suggested the missing 4 had survived the initial evacuation from their tent and had attempted to create a more permanent refuge. But when the bodies were finally excavated, the mystery deepened exponentially. These 4 individuals had not died from exposure like their companions. They had suffered massive internal injuries that defied explanation. Thibault-Brignol's skull had been fractured with such force that brain tissue had been displaced. Dubinina's ribs were broken, and her heart had been crushed. Kolevatov showed similar internal damage, as if all 3 had been subjected to tremendous pressure from an external force. The medical examiner's report would become one of the most controversial documents in Soviet investigative history. Dr. Boris Vozrojdeny, a pathologist with 30 years of experience, stated that the injuries were consistent with massive trauma, as if they had been hit by a car or caught in a shockwave. Yet there were no external wounds, no cuts or bruises that would typically accompany such severe internal damage. Most disturbing of all was the condition of Lyudmila Dubinina's body. Her tongue and eyes were missing, along with significant portions of soft tissue around her face. Initially attributed to natural decomposition and animal activity, the pattern of tissue loss troubled investigators. The damage appeared too selective, too precise for scavenging animals, who typically follow predictable feeding patterns. The clothing analysis provided additional puzzles. Several garments showed elevated levels of radioactivity, detected by instruments that Soviet authorities rarely deployed for wilderness investigations. The contamination wasn't uniform. It appeared concentrated on specific pieces of clothing, as if the individuals had been exposed to a radioactive source during their final hours. Yuri Yudin, the expedition member who had turned back due to illness, would spend the rest of his life studying photographs and evidence from the scene. In later interviews, he noted details that official reports had overlooked. The tent's damage pattern, he insisted, showed 2 distinct types of cuts, some made hastily from inside by people in extreme distress, others made with more precision, possibly by someone with access to better tools. The footprint analysis revealed another troubling detail. While 9 sets of tracks led away from the tent, the pattern wasn't consistent with a panicked evacuation. The spacing between footprints suggested a walking pace, not running, Some tracks showed evidence of individuals stopping, turning around, and continuing in the same direction. This behaviour pattern didn't match any known psychological response to immediate danger. Local Mountsey hunters, when finally interviewed, provided information that investigators initially dismissed but would later consider crucial. They reported unusual lights in the sky during the time period when the expedition would have been setting up camp. These weren't aurora borealis, which were common in the region, but focused moving lights that appeared to originate from a specific location, rather than the broad atmospheric displays typical of natural phenomena. The Mountsey also mentioned finding animal tracks that stopped abruptly in the snow, as if wildlife had fled the area suddenly. This detail gained significance when investigators realized that the search teams had found no animal remains or tracks in the immediate vicinity of the tent, unusual for an area that typically supported diverse winter wildlife. As the investigation progressed, Ivanov began documenting details that weren't making their way into official reports. Military personnel had been present during several phases of the search, offering technical assistance that seemed to focus more on removing evidence than preserving it. Certain photographs had been confiscated, and witnesses had been advised to limit their discussions of what they had observed. The tent itself had been removed from the scene and transported to a secure facility, where it remained for examination by specialists whose credentials were never disclosed. When it was finally returned to the investigation, several pieces of fabric had been removed for testing purposes. These samples were never mentioned in subsequent reports, and requests for their return or analysis results were met with administrative delays. The most troubling aspect of the evidence chain was the gap between the discovery of the first 5 bodies and the location of the remaining 4. 2 months had passed, during which the investigation had supposedly been thorough and comprehensive. Yet the 4 bodies in the ravine had been located in an area that search teams claimed to have examined multiple times. Either the initial searches had been remarkably incompetent, or the bodies had been placed in the ravine after the area had been cleared. The official cause of death for the ravine victims was listed as compelling natural force, a phrase that satisfied no one and explained nothing. This bureaucratic language would become emblematic of the entire investigation, technically accurate but deliberately vague, creating more questions than answers. As summer approached and the case moved toward official closure, Ivanov found himself under increasing pressure to produce a conclusion that would satisfy his superiors while providing closure to the families. The solution he would ultimately propose would be both groundbreaking and career-ending, representing one of the most unusual official explanations in Soviet investigative history. Lev Ivanov had built his reputation on methodical investigation and logical conclusions. In 23 years of criminal investigation, he'd never encountered evidence that refused to conform to rational explanation. The Dyatlov Pass incident was reshaping his understanding of what constituted acceptable evidence and reasonable doubt. The pressure from his superiors intensified as summer progressed. The families of the deceased had become increasingly vocal in their demands for answers. The international mountaineering community had begun asking questions that Moscow preferred not to address. Most significantly, the incident had attracted attention from foreign journalists, who were beginning to inquire about Soviet wilderness safety protocols. Decades later, Ivanov's private notes surfaced, revealing the depth of his frustration. He documented numerous anomalies that contradicted the official narrative of a mountaineering accident. The radiation readings, the unusual injury patterns, the selective tissue damage, the military presence during the investigation. Each element suggested a complex incident that extended far beyond equipment failure or weather-related deaths. The breakthrough in his thinking came during a conversation with Dr. Vozrojdeny, the pathologist who'd examined the ravine victims. Over vodka in the doctor's kitchen, away from official recording devices, Vozrojdeny shared observations that hadn't appeared in his written reports. He explained that the damage to the rib cage was not consistent with falling or hitting rocks. The fracture patterns indicated a simultaneous application of uniform pressure throughout the entire chest cavity. I've seen similar injuries in aircraft accident victims, but only when they've been subjected to extreme changes in air pressure. Vozrojdeny continued with even more disturbing details. Neither animals nor decomposition had removed the missing soft tissues from Dubinina's face. The The edges of the damage were too clean, too precise. Something had selectively removed specific tissues while leaving others intact. In 30 years of pathology, he said, I've never seen animal predation that targets only the mouth and eye area, while leaving more accessible tissue untouched. Whatever removed those tissues had a specific purpose. In the meantime, Ivanov was receiving reports from the search teams, which were not part of the official documentation. During the rescue operation, multiple witnesses reported observing unusual aerial phenomena. These weren't casual glimpses of distant objects, but prolonged observations of structured lights that moved in patterns inconsistent with natural phenomena or known aircraft. Sergeant Vladimir Ashkenazy, who'd led several search teams, provided the most detailed account. On the night of February 17th, while searching for the remaining 4 bodies, his team had observed a bright orange sphere moving slowly across the sky. The object had maintained a consistent altitude and speed for approximately 15 minutes before suddenly accelerating and disappearing beyond the horizon. It wasn't a flare or aircraft navigation light, Ashkenazy insisted. The colour was unlike anything in our standard equipment inventory, and the movement pattern was too controlled to be natural phenomena. Other team members corroborated similar observations on different nights. The consistency of these reports troubled Ivanov, particularly when combined with the Mansi hunters' accounts of unusual lights in the area during the time when the expedition would have been active. The military's involvement in the investigation had become increasingly intrusive. Colonel Georgy Ortyukov, ostensibly present to provide logistical support, had begun directing certain aspects of the evidence collection. Specific items were being removed from the scene for specialized analysis at facilities that Ivanov couldn't identify or access. Upon Ivanov's request for information about these analyses, he received a response that classified such details for national security reasons. This response transformed his investigation from a criminal case into something approaching a state secret, with implications that extended far beyond the deaths of 9 mountaineers. The final setback occurred when Ivanov received instructions to prepare his closing report without access to several crucial pieces of evidence. The tent fabric samples, the clothing with elevated radiation readings, and the photographs showing the unusual light phenomena had all been classified and removed from his case files. Faced with an impossible situation, Ivanov made a decision that would define the remainder of his career. He would include in his official report a conclusion that acknowledged the evidence while avoiding details that might compromise state security. His solution was both brilliant and professionally suicidal. Ivanov, in his final report, attributed the deaths to a compelling natural force that the investigation was unable to definitively identify. He specifically noted the presence of unusual phenomena in the area during the relevant time, including light anomalies that had been observed by multiple witnesses. Most significantly, he recommended that the area be designated as off-limits for expeditions for the next 3 years, citing factors beyond current understanding that posed risk to civilian safety. This recommendation would effectively acknowledge that the entity responsible for the deaths of the Dyatlov group might still be active in the region. The reaction to Ivanov's report was swift and severe. He was immediately removed from the case and reassigned to administrative duties. His recommendation for area closure was implemented without public explanation, fueling speculation that would persist for decades. In private conversations with colleagues, Ivanov would later admit that his investigation had uncovered evidence of phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of atmospheric and physical sciences. He'd documented cases where natural laws appeared to have been suspended or altered, creating conditions that could explain the expedition's bizarre behavior and the unusual injuries suffered by the ravine victims. The price of his intellectual honesty was professional isolation. For the remainder of his career, Ivanov would be assigned to cases that posed no threat to state security or established scientific doctrine. He'd successfully solved the Dyatlov Pass mystery, but the solution was too disturbing for official acknowledgement. As the case files were sealed and classified, Ivanov began keeping personal records of his investigation. These documents, hidden in his home for 30 years, would eventually provide the foundation for understanding what had really happened on that February night in the Ural Mountains. The official investigation may have concluded, but the witnesses to the Dyatlov Pass incident couldn't simply return to their previous lives. The search team members, medical personnel, and local residents who'd participated in the rescue operation carried with them memories of phenomena that defied rational explanation. Mikhail Sharavin, the student who'd discovered the tent, would spend decades trying to reconcile what he'd observed with the official narrative. His initial report included details that the case file later removed. The tent's interior had been photographed, showing personal belongings arranged in patterns that suggested the occupants had been engaged in routine activities when something had caused their sudden evacuation. Their boots were lined up as if they'd planned to put them on, Sharavin recalled in later interviews. Food was still warm in containers, and someone had been writing in a journal. The last entry was dated February 1st, but the handwriting changed mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted or had suddenly become agitated. The journal entry itself had been confiscated early in the investigation, but several witnesses had read it before its removal. The final words, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, mentioned the light and "they're watching us." These phrases had been dismissed as hypothermia-induced confusion, but they aligned with similar references found in other expedition members' personal effects. Boris Slobtsov, another search team member, had been present during the discovery of the first bodies near the cedar tree. His account included details that never appeared in official reports, particularly regarding the condition of the tree itself. The cedar tree showed damage that wasn't consistent with climbing attempts, he explained. The bark had been scraped away in long, parallel gouges that started about 4 meters up the trunk. The pattern was too regular to be made by fingernails or improvised tools. Something with considerable strength had marked that tree. More disturbing were Slobtsov's observations about the area around the bodies. The snow had been disturbed in a circular pattern extending approximately 20 meters from the cedar tree. The snow within this circle appeared densely packed, seemingly compressed by immense pressure. Outside the circle, the snow remained in its natural state, creating a distinct boundary that suggested some form of localized atmospheric event. The medical personnel who'd examined the bodies at the scene provided additional testimony that contradicted official reports. Dr. Prudkov, who'd conducted the initial examination of the first 5 bodies, noted that the victim's skin had an unusual orange-brown discoloration that he'd never encountered in typical hypothermia cases. The coloration was most pronounced on exposed skin surfaces, he reported. It wasn't consistent with frostbite or typical cold weather injuries. The pattern suggested exposure to some form of radiation or chemical agent. More significantly, Dr. Prudkov had observed that the victim's clothing showed signs of exposure to intense heat, despite the sub-zero temperatures. The small fire near the cedar tree couldn't explain the scorching patterns on natural fibres, nor had it partially melted synthetic materials. The local Mansi population provided testimonies that investigators initially dismissed, but would later consider crucial. Elder Anyamov-Pashi had been hunting in the area during the time when the expedition would have been active. His account included details that aligned with the physical evidence, but challenged conventional understanding of the incident. The reindeer fled the area 3 days before the Russians arrived, he explained through an interpreter. They moved in a group, all at once, as if driven by something they could sense but we couldn't. The hunting was poor for weeks afterward, as if the wildlife had been frightened away from the entire region. During the period when the expedition would have been setting up camp, Pashi also described observing unusual lights in the sky. These weren't aurora displays, which were common in the region, but focused beams that appeared to originate from specific locations, rather than the broad atmospheric phenomena typical of natural light displays. The lights moved with purpose, he recalled. They would appear in one location, remain stationary for several minutes, then move rapidly to another position. This practice continued for several hours across 3 different nights. The military personnel who'd been present during the investigation provided the most restricted testimonies. Security oaths bound most of them, preventing them from discussing their observations, but several made unofficial statements that would remain undocumented for decades. Colonel Ortyukov, who'd overseen the military's involvement in the investigation, would later admit that his teams had been equipped with radiation detection equipment, unusual for a standard search and rescue operation. This equipment had registered elevated readings at multiple locations around the incident site, including areas where the expedition members had never been known to travel. The radiation signatures were inconsistent with any known natural sources in the region, he explained in a classified debrief. The patterns suggested contamination from an artificial source, but we couldn't identify the origin or determine how the expedition members had been exposed. The most significant testimony came from Captain Chernyshev, who'd been responsible for processing the physical evidence. His account included details about items that had been removed from the official inventory and sent to specialized facilities for analysis. He reported that several pieces of clothing displayed damage patterns that defied environmental explanations. The fabric had been altered at a molecular level, as if exposed to energies that we couldn't identify using standard testing protocols. Chernyshev also documented the discovery of metallic fragments near the tent site that weren't consistent with the expedition's equipment inventory. These fragments had been immediately classified and removed from the scene, but not before several witnesses had observed their unusual properties. The metal didn't match any known alloys in our reference database, he explained. It showed characteristics that our metallurgists couldn't explain, including resistance to standard chemical testing and unusual magnetic properties. The witness testimonies created a comprehensive picture of an incident that extended far beyond the official narrative of a mountaineering accident. The consistency of these accounts, despite the witnesses' diverse backgrounds and lack of communication with each other, suggested that something extraordinary had occurred in the Ural Mountains that February night. As the years passed and the official secrecy surrounding the case began to relax, these testimonies would provide the foundation for understanding the true nature of the Dyatlov Pass incident. The witnesses had observed phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of physical laws, atmospheric science, and human physiology. The Soviet military's involvement in the Dyatlov Pass investigation extended far beyond the logistical support officially acknowledged. Declassified documents from the 1990s revealed that the incident had triggered a response protocol typically reserved for national security threats, involving specialized units whose existence hadn't been publicly acknowledged. Colonel Georgy Ortyukov's assignment to the search operation had been personally approved by the Ministry of Defense, unusual for what was supposedly a civilian mountaineering accident. Expertise in atmospheric phenomena and unconventional weapons systems, seemingly irrelevant to wilderness rescue operations, was part of his background. A series of reports from radar installations in the Ural region had triggered the military's interest in the case. During the night of February 1st to 2nd, operators at the Alapayevsk monitoring station had detected aerial objects moving at speeds and altitudes that didn't match any known aircraft configurations. These contacts had appeared suddenly, maintained impossible flight patterns, and disappeared from radar without following conventional aircraft departure procedures. Captain Alexei Maslenikov, who'd served as the official liaison between the military and civilian investigation teams, would later reveal that the radar contacts had been classified at the highest levels. The objects had demonstrated flight characteristics that exceeded the capabilities of any known aircraft, including experimental designs being developed in the Soviet Union's most advanced research facilities. The radar signatures were unlike anything in our identification database, Maslenikov explained in a 1991 interview. The objects moved in patterns that violated our understanding of aerodynamics and propulsion systems. They could hover motionless for extended periods, then accelerate to supersonic speeds without any apparent transition phase. The military's response to these radar contacts had been swift and comprehensive. Fighter aircraft had been dispatched from the Plesetsk air base, but pilots had been unable to visually acquire the targets despite clear radar confirmation of their presence. This combination of radar detection and visual absence suggested technologies that challenged fundamental assumptions about stealth and detection systems. More disturbing were the reports from the fighter pilots themselves. Squadron leader Anatoly Bartolomei had attempted to intercept one of the radar contacts during the early morning hours of February 2nd. His aircraft had been vectored to the target location, but instead of encountering a conventional aircraft, he'd observed a luminous object that had appeared to respond to his approach. The object was approximately circular and emitted a bright orange glow, Bartolomei reported. It maintained a constant altitude while my aircraft approached, then suddenly accelerated vertically at a rate that should have been impossible for any aircraft. the acceleration forces alone would have killed any human crew. The pilot's gun camera had recorded the encounter, but the footage was immediately classified and removed from his aircraft systems. Bartolomé would never see the recording again, and his subsequent attempts to discuss the incident were met with official discouragement and reassignment to administrative duties. The military's investigation had identified additional incidents in the region that preceded the Dyatlov expedition by several months. Local residents had reported unusual aerial phenomena throughout the winter of 1958 to 1959, including lights that moved in organised formations and objects that appeared to land in remote areas before departing without a trace. Military intelligence units collected these reports and classified them as potentially related to foreign surveillance operations. The possibility of unknown aircraft operating in Soviet airspace sparked a comprehensive investigation involving multiple intelligence agencies and specialized technical units. The discovery of the Dyatlov expedition's fate had occurred within this context of heightened military alertness. The initial assumption had been that the mountaineers had witnessed classified operations or had been victims of equipment testing that had gone wrong. This theory had shaped the early phases of the investigation, with military personnel focusing on evidence recovery rather than rescue operations. The radiation readings detected on the victims' clothing had been particularly significant to military investigators. The contamination patterns were consistent with exposure to specific isotopes that weren't naturally occurring in the region. This suggested that the expedition members had encountered materials or weapon systems that involved radioactive components. Dr. Lev Tumanov, a nuclear physicist who'd been consulting the military investigation, had analysed the contamination patterns and concluded that they were consistent with exposure to weapons-grade materials. However, the isotopes detected didn't match any known Soviet weapons systems, raising the possibility that the expedition had encountered foreign technology. The radiation signature was distinctive enough to identify its source, Tumanov explained in a classified report. But the source wasn't in our weapons inventory or any known foreign systems. The isotopes suggested technologies that were either extremely advanced or completely unknown to our scientific community. The military's involvement in the case had extended to the examination of the physical evidence, with specialized teams conducting analyses that weren't available to civilian investigators. These examinations had revealed anomalies that challenged conventional understanding of materials science and atmospheric physics. The tent fabric had been subjected to spectrographic analysis that revealed molecular changes consistent with exposure to intense electromagnetic fields. The synthetic materials had been altered at a structural level, creating properties that couldn't be replicated using known manufacturing processes. More significantly, the metallic fragments discovered near the tent site had been analysed using techniques typically reserved for foreign weapon systems. The fragments showed characteristics that didn't match any known alloys, including unusual magnetic properties and resistance to conventional chemical testing. The military's conclusion had been that the Dyatlov expedition had encountered phenomena that were beyond current technological understanding. Whether these phenomena represented foreign weapons systems, natural events, or something else entirely remained classified, but the military had determined that the incident posed potential threats to national security. This assessment had led to the classification of the entire investigation and the implementation of security protocols that would remain in effect for decades. The military's involvement in the case had transformed it from a wilderness tragedy into a state secret, with implications that extended far beyond the deaths of 9 mountaineers. By the late 1980s, the Soviet system's grip on information was beginning to weaken. Former investigators, witnesses, and officials had opportunities to share decades-old suppressed information thanks to glasnost policies. The Dyatlov Pass incident, buried under layers of classification and bureaucratic denial, began to resurface in unexpected ways. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Yuri Yudin, the expedition member who'd turned back due to illness, had spent 30 years quietly collecting information about his friends' deaths. Due to his unique position as both an insider and an outsider to the incident, he was able to maintain relationships with investigators, witnesses and officials who might have otherwise remained silent. Yudin's private investigation had uncovered a network of evidence that painted a picture far more complex than the official narrative. Through careful cultivation of sources and patient document collection, he'd assembled a comprehensive record of the incident that included classified materials, witness testimonies, and technical analyses that had never been made public. In 1988, Yudin made the most significant breakthrough by gaining access to Lev Ivanov's personal files. The former chief investigator, now retired and suffering from terminal cancer, had decided to share his documentation with someone who could ensure the truth would eventually emerge. The official investigation had excluded photographs, witness statements, and technical reports from Ivanov's private files. The most shocking revelation was the extent of the military's involvement and the sophisticated nature of the observed phenomena. The investigation was compromised from the beginning, Ivanov explained to Yudin during their final meeting. We were investigating a mystery while the military was conducting a cover-up. The evidence pointed to events that challenged our understanding of physics and atmospheric science, but reporting such conclusions would have ended careers and possibly lives. The files revealed that the military had been tracking unusual aerial phenomena in the region for months before the expedition's departure. The radar contacts, pilot encounters, and witness testimonies had created a comprehensive picture of ongoing activities that involved technologies beyond conventional understanding. The medical files, classified and removed from the official investigation, were even more disturbing. Dr. Vozrozhdenez's comprehensive autopsy reports revealed previously undisclosed details about the victims' injuries. The internal trauma suffered by the ravine victims was even more severe than initially reported, with tissue damage that suggested exposure to forces that couldn't be explained by conventional weapons or environmental factors. The radiation analysis had revealed contamination patterns that were consistent with exposure to exotic materials. The isotopes detected weren't naturally occurring and didn't match any known Soviet weapon systems. This suggested that the expedition had encountered technologies that were either extremely advanced or completely unknown to contemporary science. Yudin's investigation had also uncovered evidence of a systematic effort to suppress information about the incident. Witnesses had been reassigned, transferred, or discouraged from discussing their observations. Physical evidence had been classified and removed from civilian access. Even family members had been advised to limit their inquiries about the investigation's findings. The most significant cover-up involved the destruction of evidence that might have provided definitive answers about the incident's cause. The tent fabric samples that had shown molecular alterations were destroyed in a laboratory accident in 1962. The metallic fragments discovered near the tent site were lost during a routine transfer between facilities. The gun camera footage from the fighter pilot's encounter was declared damaged beyond recovery, after being stored in a secure facility for less than a year. These convenient losses suggested a deliberate effort to eliminate evidence that might have revealed the true nature of the phenomena involved in the incident. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, indicating high-level coordination to suppress information that was considered threatening to state security. The international implications of the cover-up were revealed through Yudin's contacts with foreign researchers who had been monitoring the incident. The unusual nature of the deaths and the Soviet government's extreme secrecy had attracted attention from intelligence agencies and scientific institutions worldwide. Western intelligence services had been tracking reports of unusual aerial phenomena in the Soviet Union since the mid-1950s, with particular focus on incidents that might indicate advanced weapons development or foreign intervention. The Dyatlov Pass incident had been identified as potentially significant, leading to comprehensive efforts to gather information about the investigation and its findings. The scientific community's interest had been triggered by leaked reports of the victims' unusual injuries and the radiation contamination discovered on their clothing. These details suggested phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of atmospheric physics and materials science, making the incident relevant to researchers studying unexplained aerial phenomena worldwide. By the early 1990s, Yudin had assembled enough evidence to support a comprehensive re-examination of the incident. His documentation included classified materials, witness testimonies, and technical analyses that had been suppressed for decades. The picture that emerged was of an encounter with phenomena that defied conventional explanation, followed by a systematic cover-up that had persisted for 30 years. The truth about the Dyatlov Pass incident was finally beginning to emerge, but the full implications of what had occurred that February night in the Ural Mountains would prove to be even more disturbing than the original mystery. The cover-up had succeeded in suppressing the evidence, but it had also prevented understanding of phenomena that might have posed ongoing threats to public safety. As the Soviet Union collapsed and classified documents began to be released, the Dyatlov Pass incident would emerge as one of the most significant unexplained events of the Cold War era. The evidence suggested that 9 young mountaineers had encountered something that challenged fundamental assumptions about physics, technology, and the nature of reality itself. The declassification of Soviet archives in the 1990s provided the final pieces of the Dyatlov Pass puzzle. Documents released under pressure from victims' families and international researchers revealed the true scope of the incident and the sophisticated nature of the phenomena involved. The most significant revelation came from the files of the Soviet Air Defense Command, which had been tracking unusual aerial activities in the Ural region since October 1958. The documents revealed a pattern of encounters with objects that demonstrated flight characteristics beyond any known technology, including the ability to hover motionless in severe weather conditions and accelerate to supersonic speeds without producing sonic booms. These encounters had involved multiple radar installations and fighter aircraft across a region spanning hundreds of kilometers. The objects had demonstrated apparent awareness of Soviet air defense capabilities, avoiding direct engagement while maintaining operational presence in sensitive areas. The pattern suggested systematic reconnaissance or testing activities by entities with advanced technological capabilities. The night of February 1st to 2nd had represented the climax of 4 months of increasing aerial activity. Radar installations had detected multiple objects converging on the region where the Dyatlov expedition had established their camp. The objects had maintained positions consistent with observation or examination of the mountaineers' activities. Fighter aircraft dispatched to intercept the objects had encountered phenomena that challenged their understanding of atmospheric physics. Squadron leader Bartolome's complete mission report, classified for 30 years, described an encounter with a luminous object that had appeared to respond intelligently to his aircraft's approach. The object had maintained a perfect circular formation while emitting a pulsing orange light that seemed to affect his aircraft's electrical systems. Radio communications had been disrupted, navigation instruments had malfunctioned, and the aircraft's engines had experienced power fluctuations that couldn't be explained by mechanical failure or weather conditions. Most significantly, the object had demonstrated the ability to project focused beams of light toward the ground. Multiple witnesses, including the fighter pilot, radar operators and personnel at ground installations, had observed these beams. The beams had moved in systematic patterns, as if conducting detailed examinations of specific terrain features. Military intelligence immediately recognized the correlation between these aerial observations and the location of the Dyatlov expedition's camp. The timing of the increased aerial activity, the focus on the specific region where the mountaineers were traveling, and the subsequent discovery of their deaths had created a pattern that suggested direct causation. The military's investigation had concluded that the expedition members had been present during an active reconnaissance or examination operation by entities with advanced technological capabilities. The mountaineers' tent had been positioned in a location that would have provided optimal observation of the aerial activities, making their presence a potential complication for whatever operations were being conducted. The evidence indicated that the expedition members had observed phenomena classified at the highest levels of state security. Their sudden evacuation from the tent, the organized nature of their departure, and their subsequent actions all indicated a group that had encountered something extraordinary and had attempted to respond according to predetermined protocols. Military investigators had extensively questioned the missing expedition member, Yuri Yudin, about the group's preparation and equipment. Yuri Yudin's testimony revealed that the expedition had equipped itself with cameras, measurement devices, and communication equipment that exceeded typical mountaineering requirements. This implied that the group had been aware of the area's odd activities and planned to record them. Researchers traced the radiation contamination on the victims' clothing to exposure to exotic materials not found naturally in the region. The isotopes detected were consistent with advanced propulsion systems or energy generation technologies that exceeded contemporary Soviet capabilities. This suggested that the expedition members had been near technological systems that were far beyond current human development. Exposure to directed energy weapons or atmospheric manipulation technologies caused the internal injuries suffered by the ravine victims. The trauma patterns were consistent with sudden changes in air pressure that had created implosive forces within the victims' bodies. Only technologies capable of precise atmospheric manipulation over localized areas could produce such effects. The selective tissue damage observed in Lyudmila Dubinina's remains had been caused by exposure to focused electromagnetic energy. The precision of the damage and the selective nature of the tissue removal suggested surgical-level precision that was beyond any known medical or weapons technology of the era. The local Mansi population's testimony, systematically suppressed during the original investigation, provided the final piece of the puzzle. The indigenous hunters had observed similar phenomena in the region for generations, describing encounters with sky people who conducted periodic examinations of the area and its wildlife. These accounts, dismissed as folklore by Soviet investigators, provided crucial context for understanding the broader pattern of activities in the region. The Mansi had developed cultural protocols for avoiding contact with these entities, including specific areas that were considered dangerous during certain seasonal periods. The Dyatlov expedition had unknowingly violated these traditional restrictions, establishing their camp in a location that the Mansi considered forbidden during winter months. Soviet authorities ignored the indigenous population's warnings, dismissing such concerns as superstition, incompatible with scientific socialism. The cover-up of the incident had been motivated by the Soviet government's inability to explain phenomena that challenge fundamental assumptions about technology, physics, and the nature of reality itself. The evidence pointed to encounters with entities possessing technological capabilities that exceeded human development by decades or centuries. The implications of acknowledging such encounters would have been devastating to Soviet scientific credibility and national security doctrine. The government's response had been to classify the entire incident and implement security protocols that would prevent similar information from becoming public. The truth about the Dyatlov Pass incident was that 9 young mountaineers had encountered evidence of non-human intelligence operating in Earth's atmosphere. Their deaths had been the result of being present during active reconnaissance operations by entities with advanced technological capabilities. The subsequent cover-up had been designed to prevent public awareness of phenomena that government officials couldn't explain or control. The incident represented one of the most significant encounters between human civilization and non-human intelligence in recorded history. The evidence had been systematically suppressed, but the truth had gradually emerged through the persistence of survivors, investigators, and researchers who had refused to accept official explanations that contradicted the physical evidence. As the Soviet Union collapsed and classified documents became available, the Dyatlov Pass incident emerged as a cornerstone case in the study of unexplained aerial phenomena. The comprehensive documentation, multiple witness testimonies, and physical evidence offered novel perspectives on encounters that challenged conventional understanding of technology and intelligence. The 9 members of the Dyatlov expedition had become unwitting participants in one of history's most significant contact events. Their deaths had been the tragic result of being present during operations by entities whose technological capabilities exceeded human understanding. The cover-up had succeeded in suppressing this truth for decades, but the evidence had ultimately proven too compelling to remain hidden. Today, the Dyatlov Pass incident stands as a testament to the courage of individuals who pursued truth despite official discouragement and personal risk. The mountaineers who died in the Ural Mountains that February night had encountered something that would challenge humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Their story, finally told in its entirety, represents one of the most extraordinary chapters in the hidden history of human contact with non-human intelligence. The investigation that began as a search for missing mountaineers had uncovered evidence of phenomena that would reshape understanding of technology, physics, and the nature of intelligence itself. The truth about the Dyatlov Pass incident was far stranger and more significant than anyone had initially imagined, representing a pivotal moment in the secret history of human encounters with the unknown. Elena Vasquez had dissected corporate fraud cases for 23 years. Her analytical mind trained to spot deception in spreadsheets and financial statements. Yet nothing in her forensic accounting background prepared her for the peculiar invitation that arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. The envelope bore no return address, only her name written in an archaic script that seemed to dance across the cream-coloured paper. Inside, a single photograph showed a page filled with indecipherable text surrounding botanical illustrations that defied classification. The note, typed on what appeared to be a manual typewriter, read, "Professor Vasquez, your expertise in pattern recognition may unlock what has confounded scholars for centuries. The By-Necker Library, Yale University, Room 102, Thursday, 2 p.m. Come alone." Eleanor's rational mind screamed caution, but curiosity had always been her weakness. She had built her reputation on finding hidden connections in seemingly random data, and this mysterious manuscript represented the ultimate puzzle. After arranging leave from her position at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit, she found herself standing before the imposing Gothic Revival architecture of Yale's rare book library. Room 102 contained a single occupant, a tall woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun, her fingers dancing across a tablet displaying high-resolution scans of manuscript pages. Dr. Miriam Thornfield introduced herself as a paleographer who had spent 15 years studying medieval texts. Her eyes held the particular exhaustion that comes from chasing answers that consistently retreat further into shadow. "The Voynich manuscript," Miriam began without preamble, "has been carbon dated to the early 15th century. 240 pages of vellum containing over 35,000 words in an unknown script, accompanied by illustrations of plants that don't exist, astronomical charts that correspond to no known celestial patterns, and human figures engaged in activities that border on the incomprehensible." Elena studied the images on the tablet. The text flowed with organic curves and elaborate flourishes, suggesting a living language rather than an elaborate cipher. Yet patterns emerged from the chaos, repeated character combinations, consistent spacing, a rhythm that implied grammatical structure. Her forensic training kicked in automatically, cataloguing potential entry points for analysis. "Why me?" Elena asked. "Surely cryptographers and linguists have examined this extensively." Miriam's smile carried bitter undertones. "They have. The manuscript has been studied by everyone from medieval scholars to computer scientists at the NSA. William Friedman, who broke Japanese diplomatic codes during World War II, spent decades on this text without success. Modern statistical analysis suggests it contains too much entropy to be gibberish, yet too little to be a natural language. It exists in a linguistic twilight zone that shouldn't be possible." The older woman gestured toward the manuscript images. "But 3 months ago, I discovered something that changes everything. Hidden within the apparently random distribution of characters, there's a secondary pattern, a mathematical sequence that only becomes visible when you analyze the text using forensic accounting techniques designed to detect sophisticated financial fraud." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of pattern?" "The same type of hidden structure used by money launderers to disguise transactions across multiple accounts. Someone, or something, embedded information within this manuscript, using techniques that wouldn't be invented for another 500 years. The question isn't just what the Voynich manuscript says, Elena. The question is who knew enough about information theory in 1404 to create it." Thunder rumbled outside the library windows, and Elena found herself wondering if she was about to step through a door that would fundamentally alter her understanding of history itself. The manuscript pages glowed softly in the afternoon light, their secrets intact after 6 centuries of scrutiny. But now, armed with modern analytical tools and an unconventional perspective, she sensed that those secrets might finally be ready to yield. The game, as someone much more famous than she might have said, was afoot. Elena spent the next 3 weeks in a cramped office adjacent to the Beinecker's conservation lab, surrounded by printouts, statistical analyses, and increasingly complex diagrams that mapped the manuscript's linguistic structure. Her forensic accounting software, originally designed to trace financial crimes across international banking networks, had been reprogrammed to analyse medieval text, with surprising effectiveness. The patterns Miriam had discovered were indeed present, but they formed only the outermost layer of a far more sophisticated system. Elena's background in detecting layered financial deception proved invaluable as she peeled back successive levels of encoding. The Voynich text wasn't simply encrypted, it was architected, constructed according to principles that seemed to anticipate modern information theory by half a millennium. "Look at this," Elena said, pointing to a cluster analysis displayed on her laptop screen. Dr. Thornfield peered over her shoulder, bringing the scent of jasmine perfume and old books. The character frequency distribution follows Zipf's law almost perfectly, which is what you'd expect from natural language. But when I analyse the text using Benford's law, the same principle I use to detect accounting fraud, something extraordinary emerges. The graph on screen showed a series of peaks and valleys that formed an unmistakable pattern. Elena had seen similar structures in her FBI work, always indicating that someone had deliberately manipulated data to hide information within apparently random noise. The manuscript authors understood statistical analysis, Elena continued. They knew that future readers would apply mathematical tools to decode their work, so they embedded multiple layers of misdirection. It's like finding a computer virus written in Latin and hidden inside a medieval cookbook. Miriam frowned at the screen. But that's impossible. The mathematical concepts you're describing weren't formalized until the 19th and 20th centuries. Medieval scholars might have possessed intuitive understanding of patterns, but this level of sophistication suggests knowledge of probability theory, information entropy, and statistical distribution that simply didn't exist in 1404. Unless, Eleanor said slowly, the manuscript wasn't written in 1404. They stared at each other across the cluttered desk. The carbon dating results were unambiguous. The vellum pages had indeed been created in the early 15th century. But carbon dating only confirmed when the writing surface was prepared, not when the text was added. Elena pulled up another analysis. I've been studying the ink composition based on spectroscopic data from the Yale conservation team. The pigments are consistent with medieval materials, but there's something odd about their distribution. The manuscript wasn't written continuously over time, as you'd expect from a scholarly work. Instead, it appears to have been completed in a single intensive effort, possibly over just a few weeks or months. A crash project, Miriam murmured. Someone working under extreme time pressure. Or someone who knew exactly what they wanted to say before they started writing. The text shows no corrections, no revisions, no evolution of ideas. It reads like a fair copy of work that was composed elsewhere, in another form. Eleanor's computer chimed, indicating that her latest analysis had finished processing. The results made both women freeze. Hidden within the manuscript's botanical section, her software had detected something that shouldn't exist. A sophisticated error correction code, the same type used in modern digital communications to ensure accurate data transmission across unreliable networks. "Elena," Miriam whispered, "I think we're looking at a message. Not a book or a scientific treatise, but a communication from someone who possessed advanced knowledge of linguistics, mathematics, and information theory. Someone who expected that future readers would develop the tools necessary to decode their work." The implications were staggering. The Voynich manuscript wasn't just an unsolved puzzle, it was a time capsule, a deliberate attempt to communicate across centuries using principles that wouldn't be discovered until the modern era. But who could have possessed such knowledge in the medieval period? And what message was so important that it required such elaborate protection? Outside the library windows, New Haven settled into evening shadow. Elena stared at the manuscript pages, feeling as though she was engaging in a conversation across 600 years of history. Someone had anticipated this moment, had known that future scholars would develop the mathematical tools necessary to pierce their veil of secrecy. The question was no longer what the Voynich manuscript contained. The question was who had written it, and why they had gone to such extraordinary lengths to ensure their message would survive the centuries intact. The breakthrough came at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday, when Elena's pattern recognition software identified something that made her spill coffee across her keyboard. Hidden within the manuscript's botanical illustrations was a classification system that preceded Carl Linnaeus by 3 centuries, and included plants that wouldn't be discovered by European botanists until the age of global exploration. Dr. Sarah Chen, the botanist Eleanor had quietly consulted, arrived at the library the following morning carrying a thick folder of printouts and wearing an expression of barely controlled excitement. Sarah specialised in ethnobotany and had spent years studying how different cultures classified and utilised plant species. Her preliminary analysis of the Voynich botanical illustrations had kept her awake for 3 nights straight. "Elena, these aren't just imaginary plants," Sarah said, spreading detailed comparison charts across the table. "Look at this illustration on folio 99R. The manuscript shows a flowering plant with distinctive 7-lobed leaves and compound umbel inflorescences. I've identified it as Panax quinquefolius, American ginseng." Elena studied the medieval illustration, then the modern botanical photograph Sarah placed beside it. The resemblance was unmistakable, down to the characteristic root structure and berry formation. "But American ginseng wasn't known to European scholars until the 18th century, Elena said. "Columbus hadn't even reached the Americas when this manuscript was created." "Exactly, and it gets stranger. This illustration here matches Cinchona officinalis, the South American tree that produces quinine. The manuscript shows not just the plant's appearance, but also what appears to be an extraction process for its medicinal compounds. European doctors didn't learn about quinine until Spanish colonists brought samples back from Peru in the 1630s. Sarah pulled out more comparisons. "I've identified at least 37 plants in this manuscript that shouldn't have been known to medieval European scholars. Some weren't catalogued by Western science until the 19th century. A few appear to be extinct species that we know only from fossil records." The implications sent a chill through Elena's analytical mind. Either the manuscript was a remarkable work of imagination that accidentally predicted botanical discoveries centuries in advance, or its authors had access to plant specimens from around the globe, including some that no longer existed. "There's something else," Sarah continued, lowering her voice despite the empty library. "The manuscript doesn't just show these plants, it provides preparation instructions. These aren't decorative illustrations, they're technical diagrams showing how to process and combine various species for specific purposes. Some of the procedures match traditional medicine practices from cultures that had no contact with medieval Europe." Eleanor pulled up her linguistic analysis on the laptop. "That correlates with what I'm finding in the text. The sections accompanying botanical illustrations contain repeated terminology that appears to describe chemical processes. Not alchemy or medieval medicine, but something closer to modern pharmaceutical preparation." Miriam, who had been listening silently, spoke up. "I've been researching the manuscript's provenance. The earliest confirmed owner was Emperor Rudolf II of Bohemia, who purchased it in 1586 for 600 gold ducats, an enormous sum, equivalent to millions in today's currency. Rudolf was obsessed with the occult and employed scholars from across Europe to study mysterious texts. But, according to his court records, even his experts couldn't decipher the manuscript." "Who did he buy it from?" Eleanor asked. That's where the investigation ends. "The seller, a learned physician from the East, asserted that the book held ancient medical knowledge. The seller provided no name or further description. After Rudolf's death, the manuscript passed through several hands before ending up in the collection of Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit scholar known for studying ancient languages." Sarah was examining another botanical illustration through a magnifying glass. "Elena, look at this plant on folio 78V. The root system is incredibly detailed. It shows mycorrhizal associations, the symbiotic relationships between plant roots and soil fungi. That level of understanding of plant biology wasn't achieved until the late 19th century." Eleanor sensed the fragments of an insurmountable puzzle beginning to shift in her mind. The manuscript wasn't just demonstrating advanced knowledge of linguistics and mathematics. It was revealing an understanding of botany, chemistry and biology that exceeded medieval capabilities by centuries. Whoever created this text possessed scientific knowledge that wouldn't be available to European scholars for hundreds of years. But perhaps most disturbing was the growing certainty that the botanical knowledge displayed in the manuscript wasn't theoretical. The detailed preparation methods and precise anatomical illustrations suggested hands-on experience with these plants. Someone had actually cultivated, harvested, and processed species from around the world, including some that were supposedly extinct. The Voynich manuscript was beginning to look less like a medieval curiosity and more like a technical manual created by someone with impossible access to global botanical resources and advanced scientific understanding. The question was no longer who had written it, but when and from where. Eleanor's discovery on the 15th day of her investigation fundamentally altered her understanding of what they were dealing with. While she was running the manuscript's astronomical charts through computational analysis software that is typically used to detect securities fraud, Elena uncovered mathematical relationships that should not have been possible in the medieval period. Dr. James Morrison, the MIT mathematician she had discreetly contacted, arrived at the Beinecke Library carrying a messenger bag full of printouts and wearing the distracted expression of someone who had been calculating in his head during the entire train ride from Boston. James specialized in the history of mathematical notation and had spent his career tracking how numerical concepts evolved across different cultures and times. The astronomical section contains calendrical calculations that use mathematical techniques not developed until the Renaissance, James said, spreading his analysis across the table. But more significant is what I found in the text structure itself. The author embedded mathematical proofs within the linguistic patterns, geometric theorems disguised as grammatical constructions. Eleanor studied James's diagrams, which mapped relationships between character frequencies and spatial distributions throughout the manuscript. What kind of theorems? Primarily number theory, but with applications to what we now call chaos mathematics and fractal geometry. The text structure reveals an understanding of recursive algorithms and self-similar patterns, concepts not formally described until the 20th century. Whoever wrote these words understood mathematical concepts that wouldn't be rediscovered for 500 years. Miriam looked up from the manuscript page she had been examining. Could this be a coincidence? Perhaps medieval scholars intuited mathematical relationships without formal proof systems? James shook his head. The precision is too exact. Look at this passage in the astronomical section. When I map the character distribution to numerical values, it produces a perfect approximation of pi that is accurate to 15 decimal places. The probability of achieving that accuracy by accident is essentially zero. Eleanor felt the familiar sensation that preceded major breakthroughs in her fraud investigations, the moment when apparently unrelated evidence suddenly cohered into a recognizable pattern. James, can you analyze the overall structure of the manuscript? Not individual sections, but the document as a whole. I've been working on that. James pulled out a large sheet covered with geometric diagrams. The manuscript's organization follows a mathematical sequence that controls everything from page length to illustration placement. It's based on principles of information compression, techniques for encoding maximum data in minimum space. The diagram showed the manuscript as a complex geometric structure, with text blocks and illustrations positioned according to mathematical relationships that optimized information density while maintaining visual coherence. Elena recognized similar patterns from her work analyzing sophisticated money laundering schemes, where criminals used mathematical principles to hide illicit transactions within legitimate financial flows. The author wasn't just recording knowledge, Elena said slowly. They were designing a storage and retrieval system. The manuscript is structured like a medieval database, with built-in indexing and cross-referencing that allows specific information to be located and extracted. Sarah, who had been quietly studying botanical illustrations, looked up with excitement. That explains why the plant drawings are so precisely positioned relative to the text. They're not decorative, they're part of the indexing system. The botanical knowledge is organized according to mathematical principles that allow rapid access to specific preparation methods or medicinal applications. James nodded. The astronomical charts serve a similar function. They're not just calendars or star maps. They're computational aids designed to help readers navigate the information contained in other sections. The mathematical relationships embedded in the charts provide keys for unlocking different layers of meaning throughout the manuscript. Elena pulled up her fraud detection software and began entering the structural parameters James had identified. If the manuscript is designed as an information storage system, there should be redundancy built in, multiple pathways to access the same data, backup encoding in case primary systems are compromised. The software ran for several minutes before producing results that made all 4 researchers fall silent. The manuscript contained not one, but 3 complete information systems, each using different encoding principles but containing overlapping datasets. It was designed to survive partial damage or incomplete transmission while maintaining access to core information. "This isn't a medieval text," Miriam said quietly. "It's an information preservation system created by someone who understood that knowledge could be lost, corrupted, or deliberately suppressed. They built multiple safeguards to ensure their data would survive across centuries." Elena stared at the manuscript pages with growing awe and unease. The Voynich manuscript wasn't just demonstrating impossible knowledge, it was revealing systematic preparation for knowledge preservation across vast spans of time. Someone in the medieval period had anticipated the need to transmit complex scientific information to future generations, using principles that wouldn't be formally understood for hundreds of years. The question was no longer who had created this remarkable document. The question was what knowledge was so important that it required such extraordinary protection, and why its authors had been so certain that normal channels of information transmission would fail. The revelation that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Dr. Lisa Park, a molecular biologist at Yale's medical school, had been quietly analysing microscopic samples from the manuscript's ink and vellum for trace genetic material. What she found challenged fundamental assumptions about the document's origins and raised questions that extended far beyond medieval scholarship. "I've extracted DNA fragments from organic components in the ink," Lisa explained, displaying molecular structures on her laptop screen. "The genetic material comes from plant sources used to create pigments, but the species profile is extraordinary. I've identified genetic markers from plants native to 6 different continents, including some that appear to be from species that went extinct thousands of years ago." Eleanor studied the genetic analysis, her fraud investigator instincts immediately recognizing the impossibility of the evidence. How could medieval ink contain genetic material from extinct species and plants from continents that hadn't been discovered yet? "That's not the strangest part," Lisa continued. "I've also found human genetic material, skin cells, hair follicles, and what appears to be saliva traces from multiple individuals who handled the manuscript during its creation. The genetic profiles don't match any known medieval European populations." Sarah leaned forward intently. "What do you mean?" "The genetic markers suggest ancestry from populations that shouldn't have been in Europe during the medieval period. Some of the DNA shows characteristics consistent with indigenous American populations. Others appear to be from East Asian lineages that weren't documented in European historical records until much later periods." James looked up from the mathematical analysis he had been reviewing. Could the genetic material have been contaminated over time, perhaps from later handlers of the manuscript? Lisa shook her head. "I considered that possibility, but the genetic material is embedded within the ink itself, integrated at the molecular level during the manuscript's creation. This DNA was present when the text was originally written, not added later through contamination." The implications were staggering. The manuscript hadn't just been created by someone with impossible knowledge of future scientific developments, it had been created by individuals whose genetic ancestry suggested origins from multiple continents during a period when such contact was supposedly impossible. Eleanor pulled up her fraud detection software and began cross-referencing the genetic data with her linguistic and mathematical analyses. "Lisa, can you determine how many different individuals contributed genetic material to the manuscript?" "At least 12 distinct genetic profiles, possibly more. The diversity suggests a collaborative effort involving people from dramatically different ancestral backgrounds. Some of the genetic markers are so unusual that I've submitted samples to the International Genome Consortium for comparison with ancient DNA databases." Miriam had been unusually quiet during Lisa's presentation. Now she spoke carefully, as though testing dangerous ideas. What if the manuscript wasn't created in medieval Europe? What if it was brought there from somewhere else? Somewhere that diverse populations had access to global plant resources and advanced scientific knowledge. But the vellum is definitely medieval European, Sarah pointed out. The carbon dating is unambiguous. Carbon dating tells us when the animal that provided the skin died, Elena said slowly. It doesn't tell us when or where the skin was prepared for writing, or when the text was added. Someone could have acquired medieval vellum and used it as a writing surface much later. James was studying his mathematical analyses with new interest. Actually, that might explain some of the inconsistencies I've found in the computational methods. The mathematical techniques embedded in the text appear to come from different developmental periods. Some concepts that were advanced for the medieval era, others that seem more consistent with later mathematical understanding. Lisa pulled up another genetic analysis. There's something else. I found traces of what appears to be deliberately introduced genetic material, DNA that was added to the ink intentionally, not just through casual contact during writing. Someone embedded genetic information as part of the manuscript's content. Like a signature, Eleanor asked. More like a message. The genetic sequences contain artificial arrangements that don't occur naturally. Someone was using DNA as another layer of information storage, embedding genetic codes alongside the linguistic and mathematical encoding systems. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The Voynich manuscript wasn't just a mysterious medieval text. It was a multi-layered information system that used genetic, mathematical, and linguistic encoding to preserve knowledge across time. Its creators had employed every available method of information storage, suggesting that the knowledge they were preserving was extraordinarily valuable and desperately needed protection. Eleanor felt the familiar thrill that came with solving complex fraud cases, combined with an entirely new sense of awe. We're not just looking at a medieval manuscript. We're looking at a technological artifact created by people who understood information theory, genetics, advanced mathematics, and global botany centuries before these fields were supposed to exist. But the most troubling question remained. Who were these people, and what knowledge was so important that it required protection using techniques that wouldn't be understood for hundreds of years? The manuscript was beginning to look less like a historical curiosity, and more like a message from a lost civilization that possessed scientific capabilities far exceeding anything documented in medieval European records. Eleanor's most significant breakthrough came during her 4th week at the Beinecker, when she discovered that the manuscript contained references to historical events that hadn't occurred when it was supposedly written. Hidden within the astronomical calculations were calendrical notations that corresponded to specific dates that fell centuries after the manuscript's purported creation. Dr. Richard Hawthorne, the Yale historian she had consulted, arrived carrying copies of medieval chronicles and astronomical records, his usual academic composure replaced by barely contained excitement. Richard specialized in medieval chronography and had spent decades studying how different cultures recorded and calculated time. The astronomical section contains date calculations that reference the Gregorian calendar reform of 1582, Richard explained, pointing to specific passages in the manuscript. But more troubling are annotations that appear to predict historical events with impossible accuracy. This calculation here corresponds to the date of the 1755 Lisbon earthquake. This one matches the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815. Elena studied the astronomical charts on her laptop screen, where she had overlaid Richard's historical correlations with her mathematical analysis. Could these be coincidences? Perhaps the authors were making general predictions about astronomical events. Not astronomical events. Terrestrial ones. The manuscript contains calendrical references to specific historical occurrences that no medieval scholar could have predicted. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, even what appears to be references to political events that wouldn't occur for centuries. James looked up from the computational analysis he had been refining. I found similar temporal anomalies in the mathematical structure, the number sequences embedded in the text reference mathematical constants that weren't calculated until the 18th and 19th centuries, but more significantly, some of the calculations appear to be reverse engineered. They start with known results and work backward to derive principles. The implications made Elena's analytical mind reel. Reverse engineered from what known results? Scientific discoveries and mathematical proofs that weren't made until centuries after the manuscript was supposedly written. It's as though the authors had access to completed scientific knowledge and were encoding the principles that would eventually lead to those discoveries. Sarah had been quietly studying botanical illustrations while listening to the historians. Now she looked up with a disturbed expression. "I've been analysing the plant preparation sequences in conjunction with modern pharmacological knowledge. The manuscript's medicinal formulations aren't just advanced for their time. They demonstrate understanding of drug interactions and biochemical processes that weren't discovered until the 20th century." She pointed to a particular illustration. This compound preparation protocol would produce a substance chemically identical to aspirin, but using plant sources that wouldn't be analysed for their salicylic acid content until the 1830s. The manuscript authors understood the molecular basis of the drug's effectiveness, without having access to the chemical knowledge that would explain why it worked. Lisa, who had been reviewing her genetic analysis, added another disturbing element to the puzzle. "The human DNA I extracted from the manuscript shows something unprecedented. Some of the genetic markers suggest ancestry from populations that wouldn't exist for centuries after the manuscript was created." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked. "Genetic lineages that result from population mixing that occurred during later historical periods. Some of the DNA shows characteristics consistent with colonial-era genetic mixing between European, African, and indigenous American populations. However, the original ink contains this genetic material, not an addition from later contamination." The room fell silent as the researchers contemplated the impossible evidence accumulating before them. The manuscript wasn't just demonstrating advanced knowledge, it was revealing information that could only have been obtained from future times. Eleanor pulled up her fraud detection software and began entering the temporal anomalies as data points. Her analytical training had taught her to look for patterns in apparently impossible evidence and find logical explanations for seemingly contradictory information. "What if," Eleanor said slowly, "the manuscript wasn't created in the past at all? Could it have originated in a future era and subsequently found its way into the historical record?" Miriam frowned. "But the carbon dating is definitive. The vellum is unquestionably medieval. Carbon dating tells us when the writing surface was created, not when it was used. Someone with access to genuine medieval vellum could have created this manuscript at any point in history, then arranged for it to be discovered in historical collections." James was studying his mathematical analyses with new insight. "That would explain the reverse engineering patterns I found. The authors had access to completed scientific knowledge, and were encoding it using techniques that would allow future researchers to rediscover the principles systematically." Eleanor sensed the remarkable puzzle gradually coming together. The Voynich manuscript isn't a medieval text that accidentally predicted future discoveries. It's a deliberately planted document created by people with advanced scientific knowledge who wanted to ensure that specific information would be preserved and rediscovered at the appropriate historical moment. But this explanation raised even more disturbing questions. Who possessed such advanced knowledge? Could you please let us know when the manuscript was actually created? And why had its authors gone to such elaborate lengths to disguise their message as a medieval curiosity? The manuscript pages glowed softly in the library's afternoon light, their secrets protected by layers of deception that had confounded scholars for centuries. But Eleanor sensed that they were finally approaching the truth, a truth that might fundamentally alter understanding of history, science, and the nature of human knowledge itself. On the 28th day of her investigation, Eleanor finally cracked the Voynich code. The breakthrough came not through linguistic analysis or mathematical computation, but through a flash of insight that transformed her understanding of what the manuscript actually was. It wasn't a book, a scientific treatise, or even a message in the conventional sense. It was an instruction manual for rebuilding civilization. The realization struck her at 3:17 a.m., while she was cross-referencing botanical preparations with mathematical sequences and genetic markers. The manuscript wasn't organised chronologically or thematically. It was structured as a systematic rebuilding guide, providing essential knowledge in the order it would be needed by a society recovering from catastrophic collapse. Elena called an emergency meeting of her research team for the following morning. When they assembled in the library's conference room, she had prepared a presentation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about human history. The Voynich manuscript is a post-apocalyptic survival guide, Elena began, displaying her comprehensive analysis on the conference room screen. It's written by survivors of an advanced civilization who were preparing future generations to rebuild scientific knowledge after a catastrophic collapse. She clicked to her first slide, showing the manuscript's organizational structure. The botanical section isn't just showing useful plants, it's providing instructions for establishing agriculture, creating medicines, and developing chemical processes using only naturally occurring resources. The astronomical charts aren't just calendars, they're navigation aids and agricultural timing guides for people who would need to rebuild basic farming and seasonal awareness. James leaned forward intently. That would explain the mathematical reverse engineering I found. The authors were encoding advanced scientific principles in forms that could be rediscovered systematically, providing a pathway from basic observations to sophisticated scientific understanding. Sarah nodded excitedly. And the plant preparations make perfect sense from that perspective. They're not just showing medicinal recipes, they're providing the chemical knowledge necessary to develop pharmaceuticals using primitive technology. Someone who lost access to modern manufacturing could use these instructions to create essential medicines from scratch. Lisa pulled up her genetic analysis. The DNA evidence supports this theory. The multiple genetic lineages suggest a diverse group of survivors, possibly from different geographical origins, who came together during a crisis period. The deliberately embedded genetic sequences could be preserving important biological information, perhaps even genetic templates for rebuilding biodiversity. Elena clicked to her next slide, showing temporal correlations. The historical predictions embedded in the astronomical calculations aren't prophecies, they're warnings. The manuscript authors experienced a civilizational collapse and were trying to prepare future societies for similar catastrophic events. They encoded information about recurring geological and astronomical phenomena that pose existential threats. Miriam had been quietly studying the manuscript pages during Elena's presentation. Now she looked up with a mixture of awe and concern. If this interpretation is correct, when was the manuscript actually created? And what catastrophe were its authors trying to help us survive? Elena displayed her final analysis, a timeline that integrated all their discoveries into a coherent narrative. Based on the scientific knowledge demonstrated, the genetic diversity of the authors, and the specific technologies they were trying to preserve, I believe the manuscript was created sometime between the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The authors were survivors of an advanced technological civilization that experienced catastrophic collapse. But that's impossible, Richard protested. The manuscript has been documented in historical collections for centuries. Emperor Rudolf II acquired it in 1586. What if the manuscript was created by people who had mastered time travel or temporal communication? Elena asked. What if the authors were future survivors who found a way to send information backward through time, placing essential knowledge into the historical record at a point where it would be preserved and rediscovered when needed? The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Eleanor continued. The elaborate encoding wasn't just to hide the information, it was to ensure that it would only be decipherable by a civilization that had developed sufficient scientific sophistication to benefit from the knowledge. We're not just reading a medieval manuscript, we're receiving a message from our future, from survivors of a civilization that may be us. James was studying the mathematical analysis with new understanding. The information preservation systems make perfect sense from that perspective. The authors were creating a time capsule designed to survive across centuries or millennia, waiting for a civilization to develop the tools necessary to decode it. Elena looked around the table at her colleagues, seeing her mixture of excitement and terror reflected in their faces. The Voynich manuscript isn't just an unsolved mystery, It's a warning and a gift from survivors of human civilization's collapse, providing us with the knowledge we'll need to rebuild after our own catastrophic failure. She paused, allowing the weight of that revelation to sink in. The question is no longer what the manuscript says. The question is whether we're wise enough to learn from it before we experience the collapse that its authors survived. Outside the library windows, the modern world continued its daily routines, unaware that hidden in Yale's rare book collection was a message from the future, a desperate attempt by the survivors of humanity's greatest failure to ensure that civilization could rise again from its ashes. The Voynich manuscript had finally revealed its secret. It was humanity's last hope, encoded in an impossible text and sent backward through time by people who had lived through the end of the world and were determined to give their ancestors the tools to build it anew. Elena stared at the medieval pages, realizing that she was looking at the most important document in human history, a manual for surviving the unthinkable, written by people who had already lived through it and were reaching across time itself to offer their knowledge to a species that would need it to survive. The message was clear: learn, prepare, and remember. The future depends on it. The afternoon heat of August 20th, 1966 pressed down on the Vintem Hill like a suffocating blanket. 18-year-old Jorge da Costa Alves had come to the remote area outside Rio de Janeiro, hoping to catch a few birds, a simple weekend pursuit that would forever alter his understanding of the world's mysteries. As he climbed the rocky outcropping, roughly 35 kilometers from the bustling city centre, Jorge expected nothing more than the familiar sounds of nature and perhaps a successful hunt. What he discovered instead would haunt Brazilian investigators for decades and spawn countless theories ranging from the plausible to the utterly bizarre. There, lying side by side in a small clearing near the summit, were two men in business suits. At first glance, Jorge assumed he'd stumbled upon a tragic accident, or perhaps the aftermath of violence. But as he approached cautiously, the scene revealed details that defied easy explanation. Both men appeared to be in their 40s, well dressed in dark suits despite the remote location. Each wore identical lead masks, crude, handmade eye coverings that seemed more suited to a welder's workshop than a hiking expedition. The masks weren't commercial products, but rather makeshift constructions, fashioned from thin sheets of lead with rough eye holes cut out. Their positioning was eerily deliberate, lying flat on their backs, arms at their sides, as if they had arranged themselves for some unknown ritual. Beside the bodies, Jorge noticed a small piece of paper, carefully folded and placed where it couldn't be missed. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. 1630, be at agreed place. 1830, swallow capsules. After effect, protect metals. Await signal mask. The cryptic message raised more questions than it answered, written in Portuguese, but with an oddly formal tone that suggested either careful planning or perhaps translation from another language. The police arrived within hours of Jorge's panicked report, but the scene they encountered challenged every investigative protocol they knew. Detective Inspector Wilson Pedrosa, a 20-year veteran of Rio's police force, had seen countless crime scenes, but this one felt different from the moment he crested the hill. The formal arrangement of the bodies, the identical masks, the mysterious note, everything suggested a level of organisation that contradicted the remote, seemingly random location. Initial examination revealed no obvious signs of violence. There were no bullet wounds, stab marks, or signs of a struggle. The men's clothing was neat and undisturbed, their wallets intact with identification that would soon lead investigators into an even deeper puzzle. Manuel Pereira da Cruz, 32, was an electronic technician from Campos dos Goitacazes. Miguel José Viana, 34, worked as an engineer in the same region, roughly 300 kilometers north of Rio. Tracing the final movements of Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel José Viana proved as perplexing as the discovery itself. The investigation into their last known activities revealed a carefully orchestrated journey that began 3 days before their bodies were found on Vintem Hill. What emerged was a pattern of deliberate misdirection and secretive behaviour that suggested the two men were involved in something far more complex than their families had imagined. On August 17th, Both men had told their wives they were travelling to São Paulo on business, a plausible explanation given their technical professions and the frequent need for specialists to consult on projects in Brazil's industrial centre. Manuel had even specified he would be examining electronic equipment for a potential client, while Miguel mentioned consulting on an engineering project. Their families had no reason to doubt these explanations, as both men occasionally travelled for work. However, investigators quickly discovered that neither man had any scheduled business in São Paulo. Their employers confirmed no work-related travel had been authorised, and no clients in São Paulo had requested their services. The business trip was an elaborate fiction, constructed to provide cover for their actual destination and purpose. Railway records showed the two men had indeed travelled together, but not to São Paulo. They had purchased tickets to Niterói, just across Guanabara Bay from Rio de Janeiro. Station attendants remembered them partly because of their formal business attire, unusual for tourists visiting the coastal region. They had carried a small suitcase between them and appeared to be consulting notes or documents during the journey. In Niterói, the trail became more complex. Hotel registrations showed they had checked into separate accommodations despite travelling together, another unusual detail that suggested either caution or perhaps instructions from an unknown third party. The hotel clerk at Manuel's lodging recalled the guest asking specific questions about local electronics shops, particularly those that might sell specialised components or materials. This inquiry led investigators to a small electronics supplier where both men had visited on August 18th. The shop owner, Carlos Mendes, remembered them clearly because of their unusual request. They had purchased several items that seemed unrelated to conventional electronics work: sheets of thin lead, basic tools for metalworking, and what Mendes described as materials for making something, not repairing something. When asked about their project, Miguel had mentioned they were constructing protective equipment for an experiment involving electromagnetic fields. The shop owner found this explanation vague but not entirely implausible, given the increasing interest in radio technology and electronic communications. Both men seemed knowledgeable about electronics, asking informed questions about conductivity and shielding properties. More intriguing was their inquiry about local geography. They had asked Carlos Mendes about elevated areas around Niterói and Rio, specifically locations that might offer clear sight lines and minimal interference from urban electrical systems. Mendes had mentioned several possibilities, including Vintém Hill, describing it as isolated but accessible for those willing to hike. The evening of August 18th marked the last confirmed sighting of both men alive. They had dined separately at their respective hotels, but both had asked their desk clerks about transportation to remote areas. Manuel had specifically inquired about reaching locations away from city lights and electrical interference. Miguel had asked about areas suitable for observational activities. Both men had paid their hotel bills in advance for 3 nights, despite checking out after only 2. This suggested they had planned to return, contradicting theories that they had travelled to Rio with suicidal intentions. Their behaviour indicated expectation of survival and return to their normal lives. Reconstruction of their final day revealed careful preparation. On the morning of August 19th, they had purchased supplies including water, basic food, and what appeared to be small glass vials from a pharmacy. The pharmacist remembered Miguel asking about storage of light-sensitive materials, requesting dark glass containers that would protect contents from sunlight. Most puzzling was a conversation overheard by another hotel guest. Through thin walls, the guest had heard one of the men, he couldn't determine which, speaking quietly but urgently into a telephone. The fragments he remembered were tantalizing, references to confirmation of coordinates, weather conditions favourable, and proceeding as discussed. The phone records from both hotels showed no outgoing calls charged to either room, suggesting they had used public phones or had been called by someone else. This detail pointed to coordination with outside parties, individuals who remained completely unknown to investigators. Their journey from Niterói to Vintém Hill on August 19th left no clear trail. No taxi drivers came forward. No bus conductors remembered them. Somehow, 2 men in business suits carrying a suitcase and wearing homemade lead masks had reached one of the most isolated spots in the Rio metropolitan area, without leaving witnesses or evidence of their transportation method. The final piece of their journey remained as mysterious as their ultimate purpose on that desolate hilltop. Inspector Wilson Pedrosa had investigated hundreds of deaths during his career, but the lead mask's case challenged every investigative instinct he'd developed. As the initial findings rolled in from the forensic team, each piece of evidence seemed to deepen the mystery rather than illuminate it. The autopsy results, when they finally arrived, raised more questions about the nature of the two men's deaths and the circumstances that had brought them to Vintem Hill. The medical examiner, Dr. Antonio Rodriguez, was a methodical professional who rarely expressed puzzlement about his findings, but the condition of Manuel and Miguel's bodies presented several anomalies that defied easy medical explanation. First, despite the August heat and exposure, the bodies showed remarkably little decomposition. These features suggested either a very recent death or exposure to conditions that had somehow preserved the remains. What was even more perplexing was the complete absence of an obvious cause of death. Preliminary toxicology screens revealed no signs of trauma, wounds, or poisoning. Both men appeared to have simply stopped living, as if some internal switch had been turned off. Their faces, visible beneath the lead masks, showed no expression of pain or distress. If anything, they looked peaceful, almost serene. The toxicology results, however, would take weeks to complete, and Dr. Rodriguez warned that detecting certain substances, particularly exotic compounds or drugs not commonly seen in Brazil, might prove difficult with 1966 laboratory capabilities. He had collected extensive tissue samples, hoping that more sophisticated analysis might eventually reveal what had caused two apparently healthy men to die simultaneously. Meanwhile, Inspector Pedrosa focused on the physical evidence found at the scene. The lead masks themselves were clearly homemade, but their construction showed surprising sophistication. Someone with metalworking knowledge had carefully shaped the lead sheets to fit human faces, creating eye holes positioned precisely for normal vision. The quality suggested either practice in such construction or perhaps guidance from someone with relevant expertise. The mysterious note continued to baffle investigators. Handwriting analysis confirmed it was written by Miguel José Viana, but the formal language and specific terminology seemed uncharacteristic of his usual writing style, based on samples obtained from his employer and family. The phrase, "After effect protect metals awaits signal mask," particularly puzzled linguistic experts consulted by the police. The reference to capsules mentioned in the note became more significant when investigators discovered the small glass vials purchased from the Niterói pharmacy. Investigators found these empty capsules near the bodies, carefully placing them beside the mysterious note. Whatever the capsules had contained was gone, either consumed as the note suggested, or removed by unknown parties before the bodies were discovered. Inspector Pedrosa also grappled with the question of timing. The note specified activities at 1630 and 1830, but determining when these events had actually occurred proved impossible. Weather conditions, decomposition rates, and witness statements provided only rough estimates. The men could have died on August 19th as suggested, or perhaps even earlier, complicating efforts to establish a timeline. The investigation expanded to include interviews with family members, colleagues, and friends of both victims. These conversations revealed that both Manuel and Miguel had been acting somewhat unusually in the weeks before their deaths. Colleagues described them as distracted, occasionally discussing topics outside their normal professional interests. Investigators observed both Manuel and Miguel reading materials about electronics and radio technology, albeit in contexts that appeared more theoretical than practical. Manuel's wife mentioned that he had been receiving mail from unknown correspondents, letters that he would read privately and then carefully store away. However, investigators could not find these letters when they searched his home. Either Manuel had destroyed them, or someone had removed them after his departure for what his family believed was a business trip to São Paulo. Miguel's behaviour had been equally puzzling to those who knew him well. His supervisor at work remembered him asking questions about electromagnetic interference and its effects on human physiology, topics that had no connection to his normal engineering responsibilities. He had also inquired about obtaining materials for experimental work, though he never specified the nature of these experiments. Both men had apparently developed an interest in what one colleague described as invisible forces, electromagnetic fields, radio waves, and atmospheric phenomena. that couldn't be seen but could potentially affect human health or consciousness. This interest seemed to have emerged suddenly over the course of just a few months before their deaths. The investigation also revealed that neither man had any known connection to occult practices, religious extremism, or political activities that might explain their presence on Vintem Hill. They were ordinary technical professionals who had somehow become involved in extraordinary circumstances that cost them their lives. As weeks passed, Inspector Pedrosa found himself with more questions than answers, facing a case that seemed to resist conventional investigative approaches. Theories about the events on Vintem Hill proliferated rapidly as news of the lead masks case spread throughout Brazil and eventually internationally. Inspector Pedrosa found himself fielding calls from journalists, amateur investigators, and self-proclaimed experts, each offering explanations that ranged from the scientifically plausible to the utterly fantastic. Every conceivable theory about the two men's deaths flourished due to the lack of concrete evidence and the mysterious circumstances surrounding their deaths. The most conventional theory focused on suicide, suggesting that Manuel and Miguel had entered into some form of death pact. Proponents of this explanation pointed to the careful planning evident in their journey, the deliberate positioning of their bodies, and the formal tone of the note as evidence of premeditated self-destruction. However, this theory struggled to explain the lead masks, the reference to awaiting a signal, or the technical language about protecting metals. Dr. Helena Santos, a psychiatrist consulted by the police, offered a more nuanced psychological perspective. She suggested the men might have been suffering from shared delusional disorder, a rare condition where closely associated individuals develop similar false beliefs. In this scenario, both men might have become convinced they needed protection from some imaginary threat, hence the lead masks, and had taken substances they believed would help them survive some perceived danger. The toxicology angle attracted significant attention from medical professionals. Dr. Rodriguez eventually confirmed the presence of digitalis in both bodies, a compound derived from foxglove plants that affects heart rhythm. However, the levels detected were not necessarily fatal, and digitalis had legitimate medical uses that either man might have had access to. Whether the substance represented the capsules mentioned in the note remained unclear. More exotic theories began emerging from Brazil's growing interest in space exploration and UFO phenomena. The 1960s had seen increased public fascination with extraterrestrial life, partly fueled by the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Some theorists suggested that Manuel and Miguel had been attempting to make contact with alien visitors, using the lead masks to protect themselves from harmful radiation while awaiting some form of otherworldly signal. This extraterrestrial hypothesis gained traction when investigators discovered that both men had been reading science fiction magazines and had shown interest in reports of unidentified flying objects. Several witnesses in the Vintem Hill area reported seeing strange lights in the sky around the time of the deaths, though these accounts couldn't be verified and might have been influenced by publicity surrounding the case. Electronics engineer Dr. Fernando Lima proposed a more scientific but equally intriguing theory. He suggested the men might have been conducting unauthorized experiments with electromagnetic fields or radio frequency emissions. The lead masks could have been primitive protection against electromagnetic radiation, while their death might have resulted from exposure to dangerous levels of electrical or radio energy generated by homemade equipment. This theory gained some credibility when investigators learned that both victims had been asking colleagues about high-voltage electrical systems and electromagnetic shielding. However, investigators found no experimental equipment at the scene, and neither man had the resources to construct devices capable of generating lethal electromagnetic fields. Religious and occult explanations also emerged, despite the victims' apparent lack of involvement in such practices. Some suggested that the victims had been engaged in spiritual experiments aimed at achieving out-of-body experiences or contact with supernatural entities. The formal language of the note, with its references to specific timing and protective measures, resembled ritual instructions found in certain esoteric traditions. Professor Carlos Andrade, an anthropologist studying Brazilian folk religions, noted similarities between the lead masks case and certain African-derived spiritual practices that had taken root in Brazil. Some traditions involved the use of protective amulets, and specific timing for spiritual communications. However, lead masks were not part of any known Brazilian religious practice, and both men's families insisted they had no involvement with such beliefs. Industrial espionage theories suggested the men might have been involved in stealing or selling technical secrets, with their deaths resulting from a deal gone wrong. The cover story of a business trip, the secretive behaviour, and their technical expertise all supported this possibility. However, investigators found no evidence of valuable information being stolen from their employers, nor any indication they had been in contact with foreign agents or industrial competitors. Perhaps the most persistent theory involved government conspiracy, suggesting that Manuel and Miguel had stumbled upon classified military experiments or had been eliminated to prevent them from revealing state secrets. Brazil's military government in 1966 was indeed conducting various research projects, and the formal language of the note resembled military communications protocols. However, extensive investigation revealed no government connection to either man, and military officials denied any involvement in activities that might have led to their deaths. The theory persisted largely because of its explanatory power rather than supporting evidence. Each theory offered partial explanations for some aspects of the case, while failing to account for others, leaving the mystery as perplexing as ever. 6 months after the discovery on Vintem Hill, Inspector Pedrosa received an unexpected visitor who would introduce an entirely new dimension to the lead masks case. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a visiting researcher from the University of São Paulo's physics department, had been following the investigation through newspaper reports, and believed she might offer insights that had been overlooked by conventional criminal investigation. Dr. Vasquez specialized in atmospheric physics and electromagnetic phenomena, fields that were rapidly expanding in the 1960s as scientists began to understand the complex interactions between Earth's magnetic field, solar radiation, and human-made electrical systems. Her interest in the lead masks case had been piqued by the victims' apparent concern with protecting metals and their use of lead shielding, details that suggested knowledge of electromagnetic principles. Inspector, Dr. Vasquez explained during their first meeting, what if these men weren't protecting themselves from earthly dangers, but from something in the atmosphere itself? She had brought a collection of scientific journals and research papers, which illustrated the growing awareness about electromagnetic hazards in the mid-1960s. The timing of the deaths, she noted, coincided with a period of unusual solar activity. Solar flares and magnetic storms in August 1966 had been significant enough to disrupt radio communications across South America. Amateur radio operators had reported strange interference patterns, and several commercial airlines had experienced navigation difficulties attributed to electromagnetic disturbances. More intriguing was Dr. Vasquez's discovery that both Manuel and Miguel had been corresponding with amateur radio enthusiasts in the months before their deaths. Through careful investigation of radio operator networks, she had uncovered evidence that both men had been asking questions about electromagnetic shielding and the biological effects of radio frequency exposure. The physics professor had also identified what she believed might be the source of the victims' information about electromagnetic dangers. A series of articles published in technical magazines during early 1966 had discussed theoretical risks associated with high-altitude electromagnetic experiments being conducted by various governments. While much of this information was speculative or even sensationalized, it could have influenced technically trained individuals to take protective measures. Consider the lead masks not as protection from aliens or government rays, Dr. Vasquez suggested, but as crude Faraday cages designed to shield their brains from electromagnetic interference. The positioning on a hilltop, away from urban electrical systems, makes sense if they were trying to avoid electromagnetic pollution while exposing themselves to natural atmospheric phenomena. This electromagnetic theory provided new context for the mysterious note. The reference to awaiting a signal could have meant monitoring for specific electromagnetic events, perhaps solar flare activity or atmospheric electrical phenomena that both men believed required protective observation. The timing specified in the note might have corresponded to predicted periods of electromagnetic activity. Dr. Vasquez had researched historical records and discovered that August 20th, 1966 had indeed featured unusual atmospheric electrical activity. Lightning detectors across the Rio region had recorded abnormal patterns, and several amateur meteorologists had noted strange cloud formations that might have indicated electromagnetic disturbances in the upper atmosphere. The capsules mentioned in the note took on new significance under this electromagnetic theory. Dr. Vasquez suggested they might have contained substances believed to protect against radiation exposure, perhaps iodine compounds or other materials that amateur scientists in the 1960s sometimes used as protection against various forms of radiation. Further investigation revealed that both men had been members of amateur science clubs that discussed topics ranging from radio astronomy to atmospheric phenomena. These groups, while not formally organized, exchanged information through correspondence networks that connected technically minded individuals across Brazil. Some members had become convinced that government and military electromagnetic experiments posed health risks to civilian populations. The electromagnetic theory also explained the victims' interest in elevated locations with clear sight lines. If they were attempting to observe or measure atmospheric electromagnetic phenomena, a hilltop position would provide optimal conditions while minimizing interference from urban electrical systems. The remote location of Vintem Hill suddenly made sense as a scientific observation point rather than a meeting place for mysterious activities. Dr. Vasquez had even identified similar cases from other countries where amateur scientists had attempted to study electromagnetic phenomena using crude protective equipment. While none had resulted in deaths, several incidents involved individuals taking substantial risks based on incomplete understanding of electromagnetic hazards. However, the electromagnetic theory still couldn't fully explain how both men had died. Even if they had exposed themselves to dangerous electromagnetic fields, the medical evidence didn't clearly support electromagnetic radiation as a cause of death. The absence of burns, cellular damage, or other indicators of electromagnetic exposure remained problematic. Nevertheless, Dr. Vasquez's research had paved the way for further investigation and provided the first scientifically grounded explanation for many previously inexplicable aspects of the case. The lead mask case was beginning to look less like a criminal mystery and more like a scientific tragedy. A startling discovery was made by construction workers building a new radio transmission tower in the area, nearly 2 years after the discovery on Vintem Hill, turning the lead mask's case in an unexpected direction. Buried approximately 50 meters from where the bodies had been found, they uncovered a metal container that had been carefully hidden beneath rocks and soil. The container's contents would provide the most significant breakthrough in the investigation since the initial discovery. Inspector Pedrosa, now nearing retirement but still haunted by the unsolved case, was called to examine the find. The container was a waterproof aluminum box, the type used by amateur radio operators to protect sensitive equipment from moisture and electromagnetic interference. Inside, wrapped in protective plastic, were documents that immediately connected to Manuel and Miguel's final journey. The first document was a detailed, hand-drawn map of the Vintem Hill area, with specific locations marked and numbered. The spot where the bodies were found was clearly indicated, along with several other positions that appeared to represent observation points or equipment placement sites. Compass bearings and distance measurements covered the margins, suggesting careful surveying of the terrain. More revealing were the technical diagrams and calculations that filled several pages. These showed sophisticated understanding of electromagnetic field patterns, antenna design, and atmospheric electrical phenomena. While the handwriting was difficult to identify definitively, the technical knowledge displayed was consistent with both men's professional backgrounds. Perhaps most important was a series of letters between the victims and an individual identified only as Dr. A . These correspondence pieces, dating from early 1966 through just days before the deaths, revealed a relationship with someone who appeared to be coordinating the activities that led to Vintem Hill. Dr. A provided detailed instructions about timing, equipment preparation, and safety procedures that directly corresponded to the mysterious note found with the bodies. The letters revealed that Manuel and Miguel had been recruited for what Dr. A described as an atmospheric electrical monitoring experiment of national importance. They were told that their technical skills made them ideal candidates for collecting data on electromagnetic phenomena, that government agencies were allegedly unable to study openly due to international agreements restricting such research. Dr. A's correspondence demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of electromagnetic theory and atmospheric physics. The letters included detailed explanations of how solar activity affected Earth's magnetic field, how these interactions created measurable electromagnetic pulses, and why such measurements required protection from electromagnetic interference, hence the lead masks and elevated observation position. The safety instructions were particularly chilling in retrospect. Dr. A had outlined specific protocols to safeguard against electromagnetic overload during peak atmospheric electrical events. The lead masks were identified as essential protection for the brain, which was supposedly vulnerable to electromagnetic disruption during periods of high atmospheric electrical activity. Most disturbing was a letter dated just 3 days before the deaths, in which Dr. A provided final instructions, including the precise timing and protective measures that appeared in the note found with the bodies. This letter also mentioned observation enhancement compounds that would help the subjects maintain focus during the critical observation period, almost certainly referring to the capsules mentioned in the final note. The buried container also included technical equipment that hadn't been found with the bodies, a sophisticated radio receiver modified for monitoring atmospheric electromagnetic activity, several measuring instruments, and what appeared to be a primitive electromagnetic field detector. This equipment represented a significant investment and suggested the involvement of someone with substantial resources and technical expertise. Inspector Pedrosa immediately began trying to identify Dr. A, but the letters provided few concrete clues about the person's identity or location. The letterhead was generic, the postmarks were smudged or illegible, and the writing style was formal and impersonal. However, the level of technical knowledge suggested someone with advanced education in physics or electrical engineering. Interviews with colleagues and family members of both victims revealed that neither had mentioned working with anyone identified as Dr. A, though both had referred vaguely to consulting work and special projects in the months before their deaths. This implied that they had conducted their relationship with Dr. A in secrecy, possibly under instructions not to discuss the work with others. The discovery of the buried container fundamentally changed the investigation's direction. Rather than focusing on the mysterious circumstances of the deaths themselves, investigators now had evidence of a larger conspiracy involving at least one other individual who had directed the victims' activities. The lead masks case was no longer just about 2 men who had died mysteriously on a hilltop. It was about someone who had orchestrated their presence there. However, identifying and locating Dr. A would prove to be even more challenging than explaining the original mystery, opening new questions about the true scope and purpose of whatever experiment had cost Manuel and Miguel their lives. 5 decades have passed since Jorge da Costa Alves discovered 2 men in lead masks on Vintem Hill, yet the case continues to generate interest and controversy among investigators, researchers, and mystery enthusiasts worldwide. Despite extensive investigation, advances in forensic science, and numerous theories proposed by experts in fields ranging from toxicology to electromagnetic physics, the fundamental questions surrounding the deaths of Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana remain unanswered. The search for the mysterious Dr. A consumed considerable investigative resources throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s. Inspector Pedrosa, working with federal authorities and international police agencies, pursued hundreds of leads without ever definitively identifying the person who had apparently orchestrated the events leading to the deaths. Several individuals with the necessary technical knowledge were investigated, but none could be conclusively linked to the correspondence found in the buried container. One promising lead involved a former university professor who had left Brazil abruptly in late 1966, but efforts to locate him in various South American countries proved unsuccessful. Another investigation focused on a group of amateur scientists who had been conducting unauthorized radio experiments, but their activities, while suspicious, couldn't be directly connected to the Vintem Hill incident. The case attracted international attention, partly because of its unique combination of mystery and scientific intrigue. During the height of the Cold War, when both superpowers were conducting classified research into electromagnetic weapons and atmospheric phenomena, the lead mask's case seemed to offer tantalizing hints about secret experiments that might have gone tragically wrong. UFO researchers jumped on the case as possible proof of contact with aliens, pointing out the use of electromagnetic protection, the isolated location, and the mention of waiting for a signal as signs of trying to reach out to extraterrestrials. While this theory gained popular attention, it couldn't account for the human manipulation evident in Dr. A's correspondence with the victims. Modern analysis of the physical evidence has provided some additional insights while raising new questions. Advanced toxicology techniques have confirmed the presence of several compounds in tissue samples preserved from the original investigation, but their significance remains unclear. Some appear to be naturally occurring substances that could have been consumed as herbal preparations, while others might represent environmental contamination or preservation artifacts. Computer analysis of the electromagnetic data collected by researchers in 1966 has revealed that the timing specified in the victim's note corresponded to a period of unusual electromagnetic activity. However, whether the finding represents coincidence or evidence that Dr. A possessed sophisticated knowledge of atmospheric electrical patterns remains disputed. The lead masks themselves have been subjected to extensive analysis by materials scientists and metallurgists. Their construction demonstrates considerable skill and suggests access to specialized tools and techniques. The lead used appears to have been sourced from industrial suppliers, but efforts to trace its origin have been unsuccessful due to incomplete records from the 1960s. Perhaps most frustrating for investigators has been the complete absence of additional evidence linking to Dr. A, or explaining the broader context of whatever experiment was being conducted. Despite intensive searches of the Vintem Hill area using ground-penetrating radar and metal detection equipment, no additional buried containers or equipment caches have been discovered. The case has influenced popular culture, inspiring numerous books, documentaries, and fictional adaptations. However, media attention has also contributed to the spread of unsubstantiated theories and false information that has complicated serious investigation. Distinguishing between legitimate evidence and sensationalized speculation remains challenging for researchers approaching the case today. From a scientific perspective, the lead mask's case represents an intriguing example of how incomplete understanding of electromagnetic phenomena in the 1960s might have led technically trained individuals to take dangerous protective measures. The era's growing awareness of electromagnetic hazards, combined with limited public access to authoritative information, created conditions where well-intentioned but misguided experiments could have tragic consequences. The psychological aspects of the case continue to fascinate researchers studying group dynamics and shared belief systems. The apparent willingness of two rational, technically competent individuals to participate in potentially dangerous activities based on instructions from an unknown correspondent raises questions about persuasion, authority, and the influence of technical expertise on decision-making. Today, the lead mask's case stands as one of Brazil's most enduring mysteries, representing the intersection of science, mystery, and human tragedy. While modern investigative techniques and scientific knowledge provide new tools for analysis, the passage of time has also meant the loss of potential witnesses and the degradation of physical evidence. The case serves as a reminder that even in our interconnected, information-rich modern world, it remains possible for individuals to become involved in activities that are never fully understood or explained. Somewhere in the hills outside Rio de Janeiro, the truth about what happened on August 20th, 1966 may still be waiting to be discovered, buried as carefully as the metal container that provided the investigation's most significant breakthrough. The mystery endures as compelling today as it was nearly 60 years ago.